Excellent. Well, I'm Troy Brayston. I'm co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists. I've been president since 2019. I'd like to first introduce co-president Lucy Stewart, who's also with us and will be speaking later in a panel. So effectively, we're going to start by breaking up the president's address. We're sorry to report the minister was obviously trying to join us for the conference. To do is jump into some material which gives us a sense of, as a president's address, where we are with reforms in the science system. Then in this session, we'll move to Professor Gary Evans, who is the departmental science advisor for MB and is heavily involved in the process, and he'll give a presentation that provides an update both on the process and what's going on the outsides of it, because as you'll quickly learn, the process itself is heading towards a white paper, which was not out yet. And so because the white paper is not yet out, we can't really talk about its contents. And of course, I don't really know what they are. So anything that you think you hear me say is definitely not government policy. Anything that you think you hear Gary say is definitely not government policy because it has not been through cabinet and approved. But the important part is, and I'll go through this as a conclusion, the discussions we have about science are the most important thing to improving it. And it's extremely important that we do those face-to-face in small groups. And so that is the intent of this year's session. The most important thing was the message and being here, like I said. So what were the problems that we were trying to fix? First of all, PhD scholarships have gone well below minimum wage, and in a way that's a canary in a coal mine problem. There's a lot of catching up to do, and we have to think about how things like that happened. It's led to career pathways being a mess. Institutions also are unstable and dependent on the finances of all those things that we're actually trying to fix. In real terms, the RSI sector, at least the public part, appears to be under a sinking lid of funding in real terms, and now we're looking at nearly at relatively high rates of increases with inflation that are very difficult to keep up with in government budgets. So if we extrapolate the directions or leadership within institutions, where does this lead in 5, 10, and 20 years? These are the questions we need to be asking. And what can we do to give ourselves a system that will generate confidence for us and for the public that we can address our national priorities? Over 2 years ago now, NZAS, led by our past president, Greg Stevens, developed a renewal document, which I think has helped inform the public directions and the ministerial directions. It's hard to know how much has come from that and how much has evolved organically for the same reasons that we'd identified them quite early in 2020. Essentially, cracks formed in our science system as soon as the pandemic began, and they became extremely apparent. What we decided at the end of the day, at the end of most of a year of consultation, was that we wanted a connected, evidence-based, adequately funded, harmonized research system. That's a goal to pursue, and now is the time. That was what we said in late 2020. That had 11 points for renewal: valuing people, sowing and nurturing the seeds for more Maori and Pacifica scientists and their career pathways, recreating a ministry that really did science policy well, developing better pathways for science and policy to connect, improving the system so that all components worked together rather than in competition, clarified and supported the role that universities and CRIs and other institutions should have in a public research system, asked whether rethinking the fragmented institutions we have is a needed step in the right direction after 30 years, developing a better approach to the key challenges faced by the nation, and balancing our role in the global research system around better collaborations. The last two, we're trying to understand how to leverage or connect to or extend New Zealand's non-science strengths, and develop processes that generate the data and evidence that we need to assess the system and direct its impact. Well, that unleashed Te Ara Parangi, the so-called green paper process, through a cabinet paper, which it turns out was passed in May of 2021. That primarily looks at the area of the research system in the red circle, which includes basically the MB funded areas, including the Crown Research Institutes, the Marsden Fund, and Endeavour. It does not necessarily include areas in the universities or under the business R&D tax incentive, for example. But it also reaches into the policy that directs those areas. It's important to remember that we got here on a long path through a process that started in 1992 and was largely cemented by 2010. There's many key reports that have come out last year, and we have some really interesting anomalies when we look at New Zealand science in an international context. Amongst them are the very high overheads, generally greater than 100% for most of our public research institutions. Where does that remaining money go and how accountable is it? We've been in touch with the Auditor General's office regarding how university reports are audited and whether we can understand whether research overheads are protected to support research. And the answer appears to be no, they can only assure that there is a budget model in place. As simple as that. And that's how these strange bespoke institutions work, so that if we understand one institution, we don't necessarily understand any of the others. Another clear issue is the governance of these institutions and many of the funding mechanisms, which often overlaps. And if one piece doesn't get in the way, another one does. NZAS played an important role in these. It was not only Sean Hendy's book, but also this conference in 2010 produced this important set of papers and issue of the New Zealand Science Review that came out in 2011. And some very good material in there. What did the cabinet paper actually say? Amongst other things, it said that we're struggling to tackle the complex interdependent challenges that are central to New Zealand's future. Those include climate change, biodiversity loss, water, and a range of other multidisciplinary and collaborative approach research problems. We must now consider some aspects of our research system that are not working well, it continues. That includes assuring the future role for Māori in the research system is consistent with or embeds Te Tiriti. And then finally, I think it's perhaps most important to get past the fragmentation to think about what it means to give genuine effect to cross-cutting national research priorities. So for those of us that have followed the Te Ara Parangi process, those make us stare into space and think about whether we're really achieving those. But that is, in fact, what we're worrying about. The problems we face, though, are complex. They include the fragmentation and disconnections in the research system that were measured by this data, which came out along with the green paper in the same week, suggesting that the connectivity between business and CRIs declined from very high levels once upon a time to in the 30 to high tens of a percent range. And it wasn't much better for universities. Something bad happened almost 10 years ago, and it hasn't improved. In terms of the sinking lid, I think this is the easiest way to show it. This is university research as a function of GDP. This isn't a figure that I see a lot, but it's an easy one to make. The underlying data is there. It only updates so often, and I haven't seen the 2021 data yet on education counts. But the net effect of it is to say that we're under a sinking lid, and the part that's sinking most deeply, is actually the applied and strategic part of the problem, and we're holding our own better, at least up through 2019, at the basic research level, the part that isn't necessarily distinctive to New Zealand. Here we come to the Lucy Stewart graph, widely known, and it did produce an effect. So it directed us to understand that the effective wage paid to PhD students, who we expect to be the brightest and and best in society to go into research, science, and technology had declined well below the minimum wage from a period starting around 2010, well below the living wage. So that's now being jacked up in a lot of institutions, and there's a lot more support for that. What's harder to show on this graph is how many PhD students are not supported past their third year of study by Marsden grants or other activities. And so they often end up finishing with no funding at all or very fragmented funding. And they may not even be able to start a job if they go into that. Now, am I allowed to show this? This is a report that I understand has been circulating somewhat, and I just managed to get a hold of. Yep. And it has some really useful content in it. And here we can see a comparison. So this was done by Dragonfly for Envy. And we can see a comparison of New Zealand in the third bar here compared to some competing nations, Australia, Ireland, and Singapore. By discipline, what we see is two things. First of all, the overall shape of the pattern. If we look at the number of authors publishing research papers per million people in the country, we see all are increasing, but New Zealand has seemingly leveled off while the others have continued to increase. A second thing we see that's somewhat unique to Australia and New Zealand is a very high and growing proportion of social sciences contributing. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing, but if we subtract that off the graph, what we then come to the conclusion is that there's a number of other areas that are effectively decreasing in size. And that's how it feels, isn't it? So those are two important points. There's some other important data. I'll stop trying to show you graphs, and I'm glad I did, considering how well effectively I'm using PowerPoint on this computer. I'm going to go back to plugging my Mac in next time I do this. A couple of the other points that I'll emphasize, because I see most people failing to see them. And it's the data we fail to see that's perhaps the most dangerous. The Research and Development Survey actually surveys the number of PhDs involved in each sector. Yet, that's not reported in the spreadsheet that comes out widely. So you have to go into the Stats New Zealand InfoShare to get it. And what you find is that the number of PhDs employed in higher education has declined. The number employed in CRIs is roughly static. And the number employed in business R&D is going up. So that's where we need to see the future. But when we look at that, the number of PhDs employed in business R&D is decreasing as a proportion of the money that's going there. It's now on the order of 1 PhD per $2 million of investment compared to about 1 per 500,000 for the public research institutions. Why is it so stretched, and why are we employing so few PhDs? And that's even more concerning because we produce so many PhDs and we let so many PhD students come into the system, many of whom do not finish. So how can we do better at looking after the people in the system if we value people? One important conclusion I came to last year is that we can't just look at the policy problem as we see it today, partly because the OECD report tells us that New Zealand has a history of ignoring the policy problem and going on what they called a automatic steering syndrome around research and science policy. One important idea for common resource problems, and I think we could view a public research system as a common resource problem, where Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom identified in her Nobel Prize winning work that you could use a combination of game theory and systems understanding to look at how to deal with common research problems and essentially rebuild the trust, reciprocity, and reputation cycle that leads to investment. To do that, we need a system that works together and a system that still values face-to-face interpersonal interactions. There's a series of rules to do that, which I've talked about and emphasized, but I won't talk about those here now. I think that slide I didn't mean to actually include, so I'll quickly move on to where are we at when we look at the 11 points that I talked about in the NZAS renewal from over a year ago. now that we've actually got a government program well underway, how are we doing on those? Start by valuing people. Do I feel like the government's program is doing that? Yes, I do. As somebody on the reference group, I'm really pleased with what I see there so far. However, the problem of actually achieving it looks hard, and I'm not sure that just going beyond setting that direction as a goal to actually setting things that we can be accountable for is going to work. Sowing and nurturing the seeds for more Maori and Pacifica scientists, yes, I'm very hopeful there because it is an obvious thing to do nationally to embed Te Tiriti in any reform of the science system, and it's probably one of the things that's achievable and financeable. The biggest problem is actually sowing and nurturing those seeds, which are not enough to span all the work in system design. What about the ministry problem? What about understanding science policy? There, unfortunately, my conclusion is that we have to give it a week maybe. The current situation we have is that we have research policy contained within an economic development ministry in terms of its thinking. That gives it mobile policy teams who are actually very good at general policy problems, but not necessarily good at problems that deal with the history of research systems, the uniqueness of science policy internationally, and the problem that we have so little data on our system, and a couple other problems I'll get to. That's a challenge that we need to think about, and my approach to that problem has been that we actually have to give the ministry a chance, because in New Zealand, we'll be better off if we can make science a generic problem that actually gets funded by Treasury than we will if we make it a unique problem that we understand well, but Treasury does not. I'm running to the end of my train of patience with that approach to the problem, though, I have to say. What about developing better pathways for science and policy to connect? There, again, I think that's a really important and fairly successful looking intent in the system. I don't currently see the plan or path to actually achieve results, but that may come. It will be very important that that comes first for national priorities, so let's move on. Improvement to get alignment across the system so that components work together rather than in competition. I think that's being given good consideration, and one of the most important things that we can think about in regard to that has emerged, and that is the parliamentary commissioner for the environment's reporting series on environmental reporting. And that's reached the point of saying that the accountability systems have broken down. I'll talk just a little bit more about that in a minute. What about clarifying the role of universities and government research institutes? I would say that's been given good consideration, and it can go somewhere, and that's probably not the first step. Science for the nation, again, mooted but incomplete, not the first step. And there's interesting and different perspectives. One really useful perspective comes from Simon Upton in arguing that the CRIs hold so much of our national capability that we must sort of cherish them and protect their roles. But we also have to question if they're working, and many people, including myself and Margaret Austin, who was the minister before Upton, I think feel that we've tried almost everything we can with the funding system, and we have to look at how the institutions are formed and how they try to capture their IP, and look at a way of doing it that turns IP and the knowledge and people that we have more towards public good in a more stable arrangement. Okay, so then what about a better approach to key challenges facing the nation? That's underway, uncertain, but looks hopeful. More soon, I think, from MD on that, and I look forward to seeing it. What about a balanced role, understanding our place in the global research system for better collaborations? Here, I'm not enormously hopeful. New Zealand is aligning with the European Horizons Fund, but it's trying to do it around the grand challenges only and not putting the foundation, excellent science, in first, and not putting innovation into the immediate mix either. And we found out about that through the global media more than we found out about it through internal discussions, which I also do not consider to be a good sign. So then we come to leveraging New Zealand's non-science strengths. No idea how we're going on that one. Welcome any input. Develop the processes that generate data and evidence to assist the system impact. This is the most concerning one. Again, I mentioned this at one level, and then there's the granular data that scientists actually produce every time they try to get a promotion, every time they look at what they've done every year. Do we do anything with that? No, we're desperately trying to scrape international databases to learn something. That is a good process in the absence of anything else, and important steps, particularly by the Dragonfly report, are being made. But that is my biggest concern, is that we're working in a dataless system. So overall, good, especially in intent, but incomplete. And we really need to match our policy objectives with the system and change that we want to have. So to conclude, tentatively, government feels like it's headed in the right direction. I'm particularly pleased that great care has been taken to get a sense that we're headed in the right directions with policy development across the RSI sector. You know, and I say that as a person who's been sitting on the reference group that's been trying to design it, just to get the feel of the problem. Biggest weakness, the lack of specialized science policy that understands its history, and a dangerous lack of fit for purpose data, or the steps to develop what is needed to get that data in place. Scraping alone won't suffice, but it's certainly better than nothing. And I laud everybody who's been working to try to pull that together, because it is now much more possible than it was. The need for better data is both granular, so the most important level that we're missing is data at the level of the activity of the workforce, so that we can look after the health of our workforce and its productivity. However, the general failure of the funding, output, and outcome accountability cycle, and that's what the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report gets at, is a paramount problem. That's only been carefully documented for the environment, and I contend that environment hazards and some other things that we care deeply about are areas where the science policy works differently than it does in innovation policy that works through traceable patents. And so much of the literature is based on traceable patents that we need to understand those other areas. And we need to understand them for Aotearoa and New Zealand. The final remark is that the green paper process and consultation was exhausting, but really good. I don't think anybody wants to do it again. I think where things are headed and what I support is targeted face-to-face interactive dialogue that's genuinely open and gets more information out into the open than anybody in the science system has tended to see since about March, when the green paper process closed. And that includes making sure that reports like that wonderful report by Emily Cordell from Dragonfly is better connected to everybody else who's worried about the problem, and that we're seeing those come out and discussing together. Thank you.
Or do you want to take a couple of questions before we move on?
I'm happy to take a couple of questions, yes. If there are. We can also take them on the chat if that's suitable. Do we actually have speakers working so we can hear people? Who I think we do. I can hear something.
I think it's going to be easier to have people put in the chat if they're online. Or obviously verbally in the group.
Any thoughts? Rob, you're very quiet. Okay. Yeah, so
I'm gonna group on some of the things you talked about, not knowing what you talked about.
yeah. So Rob has questions, but he's a later speaker. So I think we can move on to Gary Evans. In the absence of questions, I don't see any come up. Very good. So Gary Evans, as I mentioned, we've asked him to come and represent his process. So he doesn't necessarily need to represent a ministry view, but he also is departmental science advisor. So he's one of the actual working scientists who's ended up inside this ministry that I've just talked about, trying to be the back and forth between the research, science, and innovation system and all the policy staff, all the way up through the minister, presumably. And so Gary, on a normal day, if he ever had one, is also a professor at Victoria University of Wellington, where he's essentially a biochemist or chemist at the Robinson Institute, based at the sort of Callahan Innovation Complex over in Gracefield. And was when I think the most important thing to know about Gary, when he thought about what he wanted to do in life, he basically said he wanted to be a DSIR scientist, right? Is that a good way to look at it, Gary? So in effect, he's one of us. Let's hope. See what he has. Now, so you've got your presentation here. Shall I try to load that up? Yeah, so you're going to do better than me.
I'm going to give it a crack. In a minute. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Katana Haka Timawana, ko Pakahaki e Te Awa, ko Robert Henderson Te Waka, Nari e Tipu, ki o Te Poti, ko Gary Evans whakainoa, ngā mihi nui ki koutou. Hi, I'm Gary. I'm originally from north end of Dunedin, Northeast Valley, where I grew up. Went to University of Otago, went overseas to the UK and spent some time there in the university and in the private sector. Then returned to New Zealand on one of these fantastic postdoctoral fellowships that they used to have in the day, which we'd love to see more of, supporting individuals to return from overseas back into New Zealand, where I was based at Industrial Research Limited for 2 years while I just probably tried to get a full-time job. And oddly enough, they kept me at Industrial Research Limited. If you want to know what might have happened 10 years ago, Industrial Research Limited ground to a shuddering halt as it was transferred across into a Crown agency, Callahan Innovation, around 2013. And in part, we went through that change process, which was very unsettling for scientists at the time. We were then transitioned after a year at Callahan into Victoria University of Wellington, where I'm part of the Ferrier Research Institute, not Robinson. Robinson's another fine institute, but I've got a PhD in organic chemistry. Basically ended up doing a lot of medicinal chemistry and being transferred into Vic. And yeah, Troy, I did. I grew up dreaming about being a DSIR scientist. My grandmother had a really good friend who worked in the head office for DSIR, and I liked science and it seemed like the thing to do. But by the time I got to the point where I could take on a role at DSIR, it no longer existed. So IRL was the next best thing. So let me see. I am gonna. Should I just stick with that? I mean, hopefully everybody can see it. I could try to. No, it's not coming up. Or else.
I think you're good, but just share that screen.
Yeah, good as go. What I'm going to do is go to presentation mode and try and share that screen.
That's the danger zone. You may do.
I know. Give it a go. Oh, geez, I see what you mean.
Yeah, that screen's just missing the share. It's really unusual.
Something else escape out of that. And my cursor's gone. I can't touch it. Oh, there's a touchable screen. Oh. Go back into Zoom. Get back into Zoom. See, it's not just Troy. It's just, it is all of us now completely. So it must be on presentation mode on some other screen. Of course,
You're not screen sharing right now. So
yeah, I'm just getting back into Zoom. Then
you've got to drag your
I think there's like two Zoom windows.
mouse.
this is awesome. Down to and hopefully this presentation mode one. So can you see that? Okay.
We can see.
It's going to presenter mode.
Yeah.
You need to leave screen share and Zoom.
Yes, I'll just stop within my. We'll just do that one. All right.
I think I know what to do.
Okay.
Give me 1 second. Here's the cursor gone.
You know, it was, while Lucy's trying to help me out here, it was interesting just hearing some of Troy's thoughts. So I'm going to give a really brief presentation because I think a bit of discourse would be a much more useful thing. I've got to go 11 as part of another part of this process where we're meeting the Te Tira Whakaheheko, who's the Māori group that have been working alongside, similar to the reference group, have been looking at a lot of the documents. And we're looking today at, brilliant, thank you, Lucy. But yeah, so I've got to dash off to them as a group, so it'd be good to have a bit of a chat. So I'm just going to briefly go through this. Give a try hitting that. And so, future pathways, current state of play. I think Troy gave a pretty good summary of this. Essentially, when I arrived at NB 4 years ago as a secondment, I was seconded for 80% of my time, 80% of my time. It's essentially full time, really. And the other 20% of my time, I'm meant to maintain an active research career. And I'm lucky that I've got a really good team back at Feria who are looking after that on my behalf. I do dip in and out where I can. So, the other part, I started kind of with the research science innovation draft strategy, which was being worked up in 2019 when I first arrived there. And it was an interesting process. I mean, that's certainly where I came to grips with the sorts of things that I was not aware of. And that was working with a policy team who were quite prepared to listen to advice, but wouldn't necessarily follow it because they would go away in an objective fashion and look at a whole bunch of knowledge systems that went into a decision-making process, which might involve economics, politics, as well as the research, the data itself. And so for me, it was kind of frustrating because I thought I was the objective one, but it doesn't matter. But through that process, we built a bunch of relationships. And then out of that, I think people realised that the CRIs in particular, this is probably at a ministerial and departmental level, what was happening was that MPI, DOC, NFE weren't necessarily getting out of the system what they needed. And so in frustration, I think that a lot of them and other stakeholders kind of encouraged NB to run a process around reviewing the CRIs and their performance. And the reality of it was this kind of it's a bit disingenuous, I think, by the departments, insofar as that they would often point to Endeavour and think that Endeavour was what should give them the research they needed. But Endeavour is just a competition of ideas. It's just set up to, whatever's the best idea, according to assessors at any rate, will get funded. And so you couldn't put out a roadmap as NFE or DOC or MPI and expect to dial up that research that you need to underpin it. And so what we're seeing now is, everyone's sort of gone around the process where NB were the steward of the RSI system. They had the majority of the RSI funding flowing through NB, through the various votes, through vote business science innovation. And in the last budget, we saw MPI go out and get a whole lot of money to address carbon, greenhouse gases, carbon mitigation, all this sort of thing. And so that will now underpin their roadmap in that space. Whereas before, you were very much hoping that you could either convince a CRI or you would get a bit out of the contestable fund. It really didn't work and led to a lot of frustration. Went through from the CRI review and then into the green paper. And you can see out of that consultation process, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, the green paper was kind of structured under 6 main things. And that was research priorities, capability, funding institutions, research workforce, and research infrastructure. And there's a bunch of, essentially putting their thoughts out there. It was kind of hard to disagree with the paper because it wasn't really saying anything. It was kind of asking, what do you think? The classic, what do you think there? What are you thinking? And it's kind of classic for me. And so we went through this review process where over 1,700 people registered and we had about 1,300 attend. Over half those are just the stats around, half those were identified as female, over half were early mid-career. I mean, there's been a huge amount of interest from obviously early mid-career scientists, which has been fantastic. a half from the Wellington region, and then over a third of the attendees were from CRIs, and that's kind of what you would expect, given this was very much focused, and I think Troy did a good job there before of showing where the focus was, and it is on the public funded part of the system. There's a lot around the CRIs, although at times the scope has been broadened. For instance, K innovation came within scope, and we've obviously been talking with Ministry of Education and others about things like PBRF and other parts of the funding system. So in terms of the submissions, there was a summary paper released, and unlike with the RSI draft strategy where things were just dumped on the internet and you couldn't really find them, these were kind of deliberately released, and you could kind of clearly go in and look. Unless you knew who'd made submissions to the draft RSI strategy, it was very hard to find online what those submissions might be. But here, there was a lot of clear instruction around making sure, that was just easily available and people would go and see what the submissions were, including a couple of fantastic submissions from Troy and NZAS. So thank you very much for that. And then that submission was analysed and basically came up with a bunch of messages around, broad support for greater prominence of Tītariti, interest in priorities that focus on national challenges, concern about the nature and availability and longevity of funding, which I think we all have an interest in, and an interest in terms of workforce issues such as equity, career development and precarity, support for greater connections and collaboration rather than competition. So those are the kind of the things coming through. Then we're also a separate analysis of around 9-10% of the submissions, which were from Māori organisations, Māori-led institutions. And so I went in there, the policy team, and the 4 years I've been there has been able to bring in more Māori capability to help them with this process. And so working together internally and externally, they were able to carry out a review of those submissions. And here you could see that they were looking at opportunities to exercise tino rangatiratanga, legislative and policy mechanisms that protect te reo, te kanga, etc. And independent Māori-led entity, perhaps. Recognition for support with resourcing of the research and expertise held by Māori, and then coordination of approaches across the whole RSI sector. So that's been really useful. And similarly, Pacific peoples, there was a smaller process of looking at their submissions and then engaging directly with Pacifica or Pacific peoples around their submissions. So I think he did quite a good job of trying to engage as broadly as possible. I know as part of this process, I've been introduced by Juliet to Troy quite a while ago at the beginning of this process, and Troy and I yacked a fair bit, and I didn't always understand what Troy was trying to tell me, I have to admit. But they were good conversations, and where I did understand them, I tried to relay those thoughts. But I also realised over time that it would be great to get Troy as connected as possible to the science policy people within MB so he can talk directly to them. And so Troy, myself, Richard Wally, who's been holding the pen on a lot of this stuff, have had conversations online, very long, involved conversations via email. Troy, it's on again, off again, I think, as Richard's workload goes up and down. But, we have tried. We've obviously got Troy involved with the reference group. NZAS was an obvious stakeholder to have on that group. We've also worked closely around the workforce survey where Troy was on one of the steering groups and obviously drove MB to look at funding the workforce survey to give us the data that would sit under a lot of this stuff. And so the Dragonfly report is the first instance of using that data to carry out an analysis. MB's written another couple of reports from an individual and institutional perspective, and they were meant to be coming out a month ago. Troy's been looking to try and see them. Have you seen them yet, Troy? They actually shared them with you.
Which reports?
The workforce reports. Survey, sorry.
Yeah, so I had seen an earlier draft and made some suggestions for improvements.
Yeah, so hopefully they'll be released relatively soon. And I think Troy was keen to get Jack involved right at the get-go, but MB decided to do that themselves, and so they ended up having about 1,400, 1,500 respondees as individuals, and then a bunch of institutional responses as well. So a lot of that data the team's been using to underpin this work. And so next steps, essentially one of these has virtually already happened. We've met with the Minister on the last draft, as far as I know, in terms of the white paper, which is kind of the product, the policy paper that we use to direct reforms has gone across to Cabinet. We go to DEV, which is the Economic Development Subcommittee of the Cabinet, and so they'll look at that and hopefully approve it in a proper. And then hopefully the white paper will be released to the public in early December, following which there'll be a bunch of targeted engagements around that white paper. And so Troy's been on the reference group, and I mean, there has been some chatter, hasn't there? It's gone from sort of a broader engagement process to one that is more targeted or focused, I think is the language they're using. So, we're interested to see what that looks like. In terms of independent oversight, well, I'm the chief science advisor at MD. I don't know whether you call me independent given how much time I spend there. Maybe I've drunk the Kool-Aid. It's hard to know sometimes. Sure keeps me real, which is great. Dr. Rob Murdoch, who as a chief executive or deputy chief executive of NEWA has been, it's been good having him there. It's been good to have his perspective. And then David Hutchinson's joined us more recently. Julia Gerard's been heavily involved in this the whole way. She's been quite a strong advocate for the process. And so that's been great. And then you look at the reference group. It's been chaired by officials, either Chris Bunny or Gordon Cossa. That's been another change to when I arrived. Peter Crabtree and Paul Stocks were very much the go-to people in this space, but they've, after 3 years with me being in this role, it only took 3 years, they have moved on to other bigger and better things, I presume. And then we've got John Morgan from Science NZ, Richard Blakey, University NZ, Suzanne Batama from University of Otago, Tanya Gerard representing Te Awamutu, Rennie from Public Service Association. We've got some business reps, Catherine Wood, Business NZ, Samiana Napai has been fantastic, representing early career and Pacific researchers. Troy Basin, obviously, I mean, to say nothing there, he's been fantastic. Professor Paula Tapsell from the Independent Research Association of New Zealand. It's not Tim McElwee anymore, it's Alison Stewart, who's been representing the Food and Fibre Partnership Group, and then James Hutchinson, who's private sector rep, is the CEO of KiwiNet. So that's kind of the independent oversight. I mean, they are sharing it with other people, and today we've got meetings essentially around what does embedding Te Tiriti look like with the Te Tera Whakaheheko, who's another group of people with Rangmatua and Shasha. There's just a bunch of people that Billy John Martin, our chief science advisor, Mally has been putting together. So we'll skip this because this was a more general talk, but these are more my reflections on just government fund R&D. I mean, how long would you like to get for? Do you want to sit down?
Well, we've got
30 minutes. What do you think?
a panel, and Rob was going to give a few slides. We should probably crack into that direction.
Give us go. Okay, so if I draw it to a close.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're having from people. There's a little bit of a sound issue too.
Oh, is it? Okay. Sorry, Bill. Okay. So we take.
You want to keep talking? Yep. So, okay. So are you all set for Rob to go on then? Shall we?
Yeah.
On?
If that'll work well. Otherwise, are there any questions? I suppose. Just
I think that's the obvious step. Any questions? Yeah.
and
Really, I didn't mention it, but so describing the other side of the who's actually involved in going up the way?
the team involved. Yeah, they've set up
Funded separately. There are around 15 to 20 policy people, both from they have senior who is up, and as Troy says, I mean, they come from more generic policy backgrounds, I would say. Richard Wiley's probably, he's the lead. Tom McAllister has sort of pulled it all together from an operational perspective, or what you can describe policy operation, but just the logistics and putting it all together. But Richard Wiley's the lead science policy person, and he's been in this role or in that role for a long time before that he's in education, Ministry of Education, doing policy. And so Richard's a pretty good hand, as Troy knows. He does know his stuff and has done a good job, but the rest are more generic policy people. And that's what you find that in government, there's a bit of a merry-go-round when it comes to policy people moving from department to department, in part to get salary adjustments over time, but also the policy is more, anybody can do policy. That you don't necessarily need deep knowledge around the actual area of expertise. The other people around you helping you with that, you can take the evidence from relatively different knowledge systems you might be using to make a decision on, a strategic to take a strategic direction on. And that tends to be because I don't know, not attitude, but that's just the way it is. So there's a bunch of people there who come from, MPI, DOC, there've been some seconded in and out of the CRIs. And so, I mean, and then you've got advisors like myself as well, who feed into that process. So it's been a big team of people, and there's been a lot of really good interagency engagement across the different departments and ministries, because to get this through cabinet will require support across the board, particularly from the Ministry of Finance and all MOF, Treasury, and then from the various other stakeholders like McDonald, DOC, and UFE, education in particular.
Great, thanks.
All right, so
Thank you.
Would you get this set up? I think that's going to be most.
They're on this side. It's already goes down. Yeah, it's very nice. And I heard from some people online that there was a bit of a sound problem, so I switched microphones. I think it sounded better to me. Please put in the chat if that would be the case. Okay.
I haven't had any.
They direct message and it didn't seem like it should.
How are we doing? Okay. Yeah, good. 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 All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucy. So I'm going to talk a bit about a somewhat different approach. I think these are all useful to come together. So this is something we're calling the NZ Research Rethink. It's a hashtag came up by a Twitter user on the Raleigh community account. So there we go. I'd like to start with acknowledgements. First, I looked at acknowledge Robin Johnston, Hammond Beans, and that's my family, who have supported me in doing these crazy things that I do. Ellen Dixon for the logo for the community, running social media accounts, and the initial prompt to make some ideas that I had running around in my head into something real. The GFANS Council, the NZAS, the Early Career Researchers Slack group that Georgia started, and everybody who's participated in this endeavor now and in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two journeys. It turns out that I arrived in 2013. I don't think I'm supposed to that dip in the graph that you put there, Troy. I'm pretty sure I wasn't. I spent about 18 months at a CRI, and ever since then I left and I started a company, and I've been independent. The company consists of Robin Johnston, Mr. Hammond Beans, and a cookbook. And we do an international genetic analysis business. And last year I fill out one of those R&D surveys. I have to do it every year, Troy. The last one, I calculated that we did 97% of our business internationally. So we are a net gain for the country, I think. I've run something called the Publish the North Bioinformatics meeting for 7 years, and along with others, I started the Genomics Roundtable in New Zealand, incorporated a charitable society. I was the president of that for 5 years. I recently retired from that position so I could spend more time on this thing. Okay, on the right-hand side, that 2019 RSI strategy document that Gary just spoke about, I read that and I had some concerns. I had a lot of concerns, frankly. And so I had some interactions with MB and the policy people and the OIA and the Office of the Ombudsman and a number of other stuff. And of course, when we came around into early 2020, we had the pandemic hit, which slowed us all down. But in the winter of 2020, I got a slot on one of the NZAS council meetings where I brought my concerns to the council. And I had been given, I think, 5 minutes to talk. We talked for about 45, and the conclusion that the council came to at that time was we needed to call for a review of the entire system. And that's what led to the work that Craig Stevens did. That first document. I spent all of 2021 as I think a fairly active NZAS council member, and learned a hell of a lot. And I recommend to anybody that wants to understand science policy, the way science works, science history in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to actually engage with this organization. And then in the end of 2021, by then we had the green paper process had started, right? And I also, again, had some concerns. And my concerns are somewhat around who can MB reach in terms of consultation. MB can reach who MB can reach. But there's a whole bunch of people out there in New Zealand that really need to interact with a research system, that have research that would be beneficial to them, that maybe don't have an on-ramp. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what could we do? And what we had is a lot of discussions with my partner Robin, and I said, look, I think we need to start something that's more community focused, grassroots, bottom up, and to augment this, to augment the Te Araparangi process, not to replace it, but to augment it. So the idea I came up with, or we came up with through lots of discussion, was Te Araparangi community, and it was just like a way to include more voices in the process and add some transparency to the processes that often aren't transparent enough. So we set up a social media site. There's the address. It has some spaces arranged by topics, individual organizations accounts, has all the bells and whistles. And most importantly, the Te Araparangi community really is everybody that's participating in it, and you're all welcome. So there's no, we don't have any barriers to participate. And so we're going to see a number of these slides, like the one on the left-hand side of the screen, which are quotes from people's submissions. I've read a bunch of the submissions. And this quote really says, there are lots of people whose voices we may not hear, who may not be very well franchised as part of the process. And I kind of want to contrast that with the reference group that Gary just spoke about. And the ones with the stars on next to them, really, they have more in common with one another, those groups, than they do with really pretty much anybody, the rest of the country. And I think this will make sense generally. And I'll just move on. So what have we done? So we all know that there was a submission process, and that there was a deadline. I think it was the 16th of March. And many of us were very busy writing things. What we did with this Te Araparangi community, the best we could, was to come up with something that's a little bit different. So we asked people, as many people as we could reach, that if they had ideas that they wanted to share with other people, to include that they could then include in their own submissions, to post it on the site. So under a Creative Commons Zero license, which is what enables that to happen. There's a whole bunch of stuff that Troy, NZAS, and others put out there. And these things are meant to be reusable and be remixable. So the idea is, like, if you read one of these and say, boy, that really resonates with me, you can take it and put it into a submission and amplify that thought. So those were used, and that's what we did. I also, through the work of NZAS, understood more about historical documents from the previous round. So this isn't the first time this happened, right? What we're living with right now is the legacy of the last time this process was happened. And so we brought some historical documents, and I'll refer to them in a minute. All of the submissions are on the site, all of them. So although this process, and I agree with Gary, is easier to download them than it was for the RSI, which I did in both cases, write shell scripts to download them all automatically for people that wanted to use it. But in this case, we made it even easier. And it's easier to access them through our site than it is through MB site. And then we recently had a focus on Twitter, which seems like a horrible idea now that, as we see what's happening on Twitter, but that's I've been trying to figure out ways to get more people to understand that this exists. Okay, so what next? As we've just heard, the white paper is going to come out soon, right? And what I think would be really interesting to do would be to organize a set of panel discussions, community-based panel discussions using subject matter experts to take a look at different components of the white paper. and put that out there. And it kind of, so this is actually that complementary thing. So if Emmy's going to go to focus small group discussions, this is a way of opening it up more broadly. And I think together those two approaches may actually have a greater benefit. So to achieve this, we're going to need help to get the word out primarily. Finding some experts. We've got great researchers, both in the sciences and the social sciences in New Zealand, all of which would be necessary. And then we'll need some help organizing the panels and discussions. So if any of you are interested in any of this, please let me know. I'm looking for help. Okay, that's it about the Tanana farming community. Basically, what I'm going to go through now quickly is a few bits of history, a few bits of some of the quotes that I pulled out of people's submissions, and a bit of personal background messages that I want to pass out. So this document here, this is Science and Technology in New Zealand. This is written by E.G. Bollard in 1986. This is a great piece of work. You can get it from either the National Library, or you can go to our site where you can download the scanned and OCR copy that I've made available. And then this quote from Bollard says, he essentially he really did an incredible job of looking at the state of play of science and technology globally, and pulled that all together. And then this document was the basis for the Beatty report. The Beatty report is essentially the 1986 version of roughly the white paper equivalent. So if you want to know what was happening in 1986, the last time this process happened, that's the document. And again, we've scanned that and OCR'd it, so it's available for you. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but you'll see in a bold, and talk about investment. The investment has to precede the other elements involved in innovation. We'll hold on to that thought. What did the Beatty report have to say about funding levels? New Zealand should aim to double its research and development expenditure per capita over the next 7 years. That was in 1986. This cartoon on the right is a classic Peanuts cartoon where Lucy's always promising something and then pulls the football away as Charlie Brown flies in the air. And it happens again and again and again and again. And that's pretty much what we have seen, rinse and repeat every 3 years from whoever's running for government. Doesn't matter which party. Okay, so getting the funding is a long, ongoing discussion. Now, there are some differences of opinion. So these are two different quotes. On the one hand, on the left, this person thinks that it's working pretty good. On the right, not so much. So you see this various different approaches in people's submissions. I want to do a little bit of historical comparison. The images on the left are from people's submissions. Yeah, some of these actually, honestly, reading some of these submissions, not this one and others, are actually really heartbreaking, really hard to read. Personal, what people feel, what they've experienced, and so that's the quote from a submission recently. But this other one is from a PhD thesis that looked at what it was like to work in ag research in the early 2000s. And the upshot of that is they were really worried about their survival 20 years ago. And I don't think, looking around, it has improved. Again, today, the job of a scientist is generally insecure and poorly paid. In 2001, Sir Peter Gluckman wrote, "I would not see a science career as compatible with human existence at the present time. Scientists lead a bloody miserable life," over 20 years ago. I think it's instructive to see that we're coming back around. So E.G. Bollard that wrote this wonderful book on the state of science and technology in New Zealand, and with the optimistic subtitle, "Opportunity for the Future." That was in 86. In 1992, he said, when the history of science in this country comes to be written, the 6 years between 1986 and 1992 will appear barren, traumatic ones, principally of the discouragement to scientists. So this is where we find ourselves today is not something that happened overnight. It has been going on for a long, long time. Okay, I've got a bunch of selected submission quotes. I won't go through them all. I'll just pop some up. These will all be available either, so they're all on the website already, and we're using them as tweets for our Twitter account. Everybody knows this is a problem. Lucy's graph certainly showed it, and we see it all the time in Thanks to really for researchers. I thought this one's really good. Just let me read it. What it's like. It's going to be an ongoing conversation, isn't it, around autonomy? And I think the nuanced approaches in working towards understanding one another is really important. Here's another one. We got to have the workforce. We're going to get everything done. This one is, something that I've learned as I've gotten to know more and more modeling researchers. It's the same story all the time. This one is pretty sad, but problematic. And when you combine it with bullying, it's worse. Sure. Yeah. There are lots of these. Lots and lots and lots. This one is the technology transfer offices suggesting that they get 10% of your Marsden grant to fund them. Just an idea, but it's in this mission. All kinds of things. I'm going to just move right there. This one is actually from the Prairie Institute. It's part of a quote about funding and grant writing. And you just let me interpret that as you like. This slide is intentionally left blank because I'm going to transition to the personal part of the story. The guy on the left was my grandpa. He was in the Navy in World War II. And when he returned from the Navy, he became an electrician. He was a union electrician, and he and my grandma Helen raised 4 children on that. And I remember going as a kid to union picnics in the summer, and all these people gathering together, working together. That's my dad. That's my my dad was started out as a career electrician. Then he had an issue with an employer that reneged on a deal, and so he started a construction business. But my dad remained a union electrician. This is his 45-year pay. He had a business, but he believed in the union. Now, we're looking around at the situation we see in Aotearoa, New Zealand today, and not just here, it's all over the world. We're seeing the resurgence of unions. And if I could say there's one thing you can do, one thing if you're working in the public research sector in New Zealand, is join the union. Join the union. If you do nothing else, join the union. This is old propaganda from the 30s in the States. Wages, they do all this stuff. These things that we need. Join a union. I'd like to reintroduce this word into our vocabulary, chicanery. There's a hell of a lot of it around our system. It's a lot more polite to use this word than other ones that I often like to use. Let's bring this back and call it out when we see it. This one I think is important. And I think it describes some of what we see. So this is not part of the green paper, but it's things that probably ought to be discussed as we discuss what's going on. And this is one of what somebody said in a submission that fits with that. Now, New Zealand Association of Scientists used to be called New Zealand Association of Scientific Workers from 1941 to 1954. That was the name of this organization. And I cheekily suggested at a council meeting when I was in council that maybe we needed to change it back. But I think it's worth knowing that that's what this organization was named. Did a lot of work. It still does do a lot of work for working scientists in this country. And let's just keep this in mind. Those are our roots. And as a Gen X American, I'm going to just say it's a quote from Mr. Rogers, somebody that taught us a heck of a lot. In my generation, Troy will probably remember him. Some days doing the best we can may still fall short of what we would like to be able to do. But life isn't perfect on any front. And doing what we can with what we have is the most we should expect of anyone or ourselves or anyone else. And that's all I'm asking. So that's me. And I'm happy to take questions, or we can move on to the panel, however, whatever suits
We are running from five to Gary to get going, so I
Yep.
think we can straight off the panel.
Absolutely.
That makes it
Okay.
So just to briefly introduce Councillor Georgia Carson, she joined us while she was finishing her PhD and really was the spearhead of the new movement of more diverse and enduring councillors represent ECRs on NZAS rather than the old white guys we've just been hearing from. So
How are we gonna do it?
partly that's how this dynamic works, is that she is going to lead the panel in the transition and will move in the direction of ECRs for the next panel. So in case you thought you might be looking at old like that on. Kerry also reviewed, he said it was too young to be old like that, which is fine.
No.
Well, I was gonna ask when all of you graduated.
So my first question, for people online watching, can you hear me speaking over here, or should we just head over to the microphones work?
I'm wondering if we can move this microphone.
Not sure which one we're actually using, but I think it's both. So you're gonna really get some thumbs up.
You've got a good there.
Okay, good. I mean, I think speak loud with that.
So you want to know when we graduate?
Oh,
PhD, 1991.
It's just 1991, that's the year I was born.
There you go.
I'm 6 months older than the crowd research student. I was out.
Ageist or lesbianism, like everything else, she won't be ageist. But
No,
it's one of the.
I was thinking about when I looking at that reference group and it's like, I mean, I don't know personally all of them, but I'm just thinking like, would CDR be the only one that's probably graduated past TK and has maybe seen that experience of being a PhD student? Yeah.
Well, that's questions.
Yeah.
That's.
So should I sit there or where?
Hold on, yeah, out front. So,
This.
the mic, does that go?
Oh, no, I won't, I won't do it, that is-
Music stops. Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, sweet. Okay, yeah, sorry. It was just. Electric candidate. It was the first thing, but I wouldn't do this if I didn't think that all of you, like I know all of you, it's me, I wouldn't go if I didn't think people had. Allergies at heart, and I can see. I know it's so that's something. And I know you're a lot of you guys. But yeah, I suppose I was sort of thinking of. There seems to be a little bit, especially between Rob and Gary, about the engagement process with the player. So obviously, India has made a real effort to, and I know I've been involved in some of those presentations and stuff. But it's a step, but I still kind of feel like I mean, I'm a living scientist and I still find people that don't know that this process is happening. From master students that don't kind of know how the system works yet, to postdocs that are just in the lab all day, every day, and that might not have been hiring. And I just wonder if there's something else we can do. I was looking back at your presentation to today, it's last year, and you were talking about, hey, if you know of any groups that aren't engaging with the process, then let us know. How do you sort of be like, do you have any response to Rob? Is it like, I mean,
Well, I think it works both ways.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to do a lot wrong. So, that's my bad, but I think, yeah, it does. Ways. I mean, you need to try, it's not to try. They historically have done it a certain way, they keep trying to do it a certain way. They brought in consultants this time around to try and, professionally consider how they can better engage. But it's been this perfect. I think it always, it's been great having Rob, through Troy, as part of this process. It's really better to stuff up there. It's great to hear the emotion, Rob, because you forget it. I mean, it is all about you really care a lot. I know you go. So long may the unions continue because I think it's really important. I think Brown Reading's really on that group up there. Essentially, what people with stars
Where they have more common with each other than communities that are seeing.
They didn't say what about another communities they represent. And West of the rest of New Zealand. I think the question might be, why would I think that they have more in common with one another? And from my perspective, you've had a number of groups that represent business groups. And I would include the University of New Zealand, the Science Museum in that category of business PR or lobbying groups. And those are essentially what those, they basically, everyone with the star had that in common. And they also, all of those people would be very high income groups. Well, yeah, right, which would be substantially much more population.
Well, I think the rationale there was that and so we try to pick people out, we may have science and there's big they're a crown entity, whether they're a private business, I suppose they're trying to business, and the others can be so yeah, it wasn't perfect, but he goes for
I think it's interesting. Let me just say this, just jump in and say that I think it can be really interesting. Here's some of those people actually say the same thing that I'm saying. Like I actually at work, to agree with Catherine Peter on the business perspective. Where are the connections? Why, like we actually expect this stuff to grow in the private sector and value what the dealers want to invest in. How do we get that? I mean, those are the questions we have to actually fix to get people look at them.
and it's for doing then sense of understand that will come in from outside of the RSS.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about people there is, like any process, it's got people that have been nominated for some kind of success or knowledge that represents the survivorship of clients. But at the same time, it is stacked with people who draw multiple perspectives, multiple hats, hence that experience, think about the related frustrations. I mean, it's not like expert and you don't have frustrations. And both Rob and I have been science experts, just unstable over the remote various times. So I was ended up trying to do my science, but ended up having to deal with the radio department that was effectively exporting results. The most of it's money to pay for the instrumentation to do our work. Crazy.
Fortunate that probably it's pretty much the same way. I've said different ways of coming at it. Like I know you guys are still fun and it's great. Since you've got limited time, I guess the whole thing I want to kind of carry is we've heard a bit of this from each of your presentations, but I mean, where does this go? You said last year it's about you expect that 3 to 5 years. My question, I suppose, is what is the baby and what is the bar? What is the bar over these next 3 to 5 years? That you could have just like me, one or two things. You just feel like you have a sense of that need towards it.
Yeah, I can't say, but I'm seeing expectation and expectation. So I think what you see there are parts of the there was work going on around how we operationalize what would a priority look like? What's the relationship with some stuff around eating? This work done long term. That out as part of what we need to get out of much today. As well as business so for me, what's most important is right first. Times, really, it's one thing we try to science was really well, being the most so people need you to say the privacy was area as well. The government science, there's a lot of work on that place. It's been, a lot of the things I want to see around the sorts of fellowships I was talking about that allowed me to return when I was here. They had been, I've seen over 100 leaders to various employees up there in the country. I was trying to come back and get a variety of responses from people like from me to why they bother to reply. To oh yeah, you can put out coming in back to wasn't a hell of a lot, so and then the scheme came along and I was able to return, and what that's what schemes mean is there's a lot of these focus scholarships, but even needed, I think to take most of fellowships, it was a good thing for us because what they did see numbers, the numbers around investing the best where they can be least by to gender about 70%. So you're able to put together an algorithm for study. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised there was a lot of social science involved in that. Guess what? That's where a lot of Māori. Well, exactly. A lot of good social scientists, but a lot of Māori are in that space as well. The STEM subjects, it's probably not a rarity, but it's yeah.
Is there any, I mean, you guys can say, things like this. That was a one-off.
Yeah, no, I think
Guys, can you just speak up a little? That's fine. We're getting people are good enough.
yeah, just go. Yeah, no, government's definitely, the officials are definitely trying to put up a case to up that further. But again, what we run into are issues around that being, when Treasury sit down or when the cabinet sits down to make decisions around what budget bids be funded, it often comes down to balancing that up against more nurses or more leads or greater social welfare. So we've got a role to play in highlighting the difference we make as a research community. I think we want to do a great job. That's all we can do in some cases. Do the hard yards, so I was trying to communicate a lot with her. So that Kevin can say, well, that's obviously me what we need. That's the obvious.
I mean, you can't tell that we're like the lowest.
Yeah, well, I had a bunch of those data up there. 1.4%, I think is currently we were at. We did, the minister was keen, I think the goal was 2% by 2027. Now it's 2% by 2030.
So it's like
We're in all of it. So I think a default government policy in New Zealand has been that things that don't actually have a really valid justification sink at the dollars of the day. They just flatline and inflation eats away. Inflation is now really high, so this has become a really dangerous time to have that sort of mentality. And I think that we need the case for what exactly is going to be achieved. So the example is that MPI got over $300 million through it. It was reallocated, I believe, from more or less the ETS type mechanism.
That wasn't
I'm not sure that it was, right? I actually don't, I need to check that off the top of my head, but you can certainly also think about it in relation to that. So regardless, the case is connected. But the case for every day has to connect the group.
Keep going. Probably should keep going. So it's pretty nice.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. The problem is that to adopt it as a field, be like, well, why should it never increase if we can't get our package to work through? But then they also can't get their package to work through because it's like, well, why don't you get that from Endeavor? So we have to clarify, and that's the national priority setting process that everybody wants. one thing, if I can, just in terms of where I want to go with that, is what really matters is people at this point. We've been through 10 years of non-supporting people. Take the Tiana fellowships headed in the right direction, but obviously weren't sustainable in terms of that case made. We need a matrix of collaboration and an efficient way to get people into the system, because it's that gateway being in the system and building a stable career rather than a precarious lottery. Especially for environmental science, greenhouse gases, hazards, those things don't work if they're just little contestable pieces of research that come to an end and then pick up again somewhere else. Maybe some things do work that way, and I think some parts of the research system do. But in a lot of areas, careers don't, and the important things for the nation. So we need a matrix of collaboration that can get us on the right path, and that's our only way to afford to get back on that path. More contestability is turned into hyper contestability. That's inefficient, precarious, not just for the people involved, for the nation.
So just to move on from that, with that point, for this hyper competition, I think we need to look beyond research system. There's hyper competition for everything. So I'm worried about, I think maybe all of us are worried about what's happening in our healthcare system. They've got the same problems that we do. What are we thinking about firefighters? What are we thinking about teachers? What are we thinking about mental health? All the same issue. So I've been struggling to understand this, right? I mean, because it seems to me that these are all connected. And if it's, you know, in one sense, in the research sector, we're all competing against one another. The research sector is competing against this sector, competing against that sector, and so on. So maybe the conversation we have is about what's the deal with the general funding mechanisms about literacy. What is that? And so I'm not an expert in economics by any means, but what I have found useful, from my understanding, some recent articles by Bernard Hickey on his blog, one about this thing called the 30-30 rule, which is not legislated. It's an agreement between political parties that they won't have taxation beyond 30% or spend budget beyond 30% of the GDP. That's an agreement. It's made by the politicians. They made that. They made it decades, and they keep at it. So the pie doesn't grow. So there's been, and what really hit it home to me was his article about what they've done with free waters. And I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about the funding. Because in order to maintain this 30-30 rule, they had to create an extra body outside of government that will come into finance. So this is a stark example of why this is important. And so it's important as it is for us to talk amongst ourselves about the research sector. I think it's also just as important we talk to our colleagues and our neighbors and the person at the supermarket and actually start, because this is all, frankly, this is all a living issue. I mean, we know that. So we need to talk about it.
No. Okay, and you know what I'm saying.
I'm not a public servant.
Well.
I'm more of a Victorian mystical. Can I be public servant? They would like to think of it, why would they?
Does the election being next year change anything for anyone, or are we just going to act like?
It does changes things, certainly does.
I remember the quote we had in the listener article earlier this year, which is the science sector. And
she's really out there, very much so. I was at dinner the other night where I ended up being sat on the side there, yes, so she's there, and I've been talking to CRIs a lot, been down in university, being all over the show. Everybody says she's been very engaged.
I'm just sort of thinking of it in terms of, like, for instance, Shane Betty on the Māori Health Authority, Melissa Lee with the TV Scar and said, like, is she getting anything specific about whether she's, I know we kind of like nowhere near that sort of level of like concrete political changes, but I'm just wondering if we see anything.
She's very.
Politics seem to be very like not specific about it.
I mean, then I was saying Peter Beattie, the later Queensland Premier, Tim Hodgson is there. They were all very amicable about bipartisan around science.
Okay. So they will bring a broad understanding that reform is needed. It might just be the details thing.
I think so. I mean, what we're seeing in kind of the values of this government is really what mainly has been funded through contesting and other funds. So I think over time, what is funded being they stand out well enough sort of morphs or changes. And it'll be the same national and I've no doubt those slightly different values. And so they will change over time, but it doesn't change straight away unless they bring in this money.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's worth thinking about, politics is also the role of minor parties and what they want, what their issues are, and whether science can represent those issues well. I don't think we need to say a whole lot of go into examples, but let's be honest, if we're going to talk about politics, that is important to deal with. And the other obvious point is that we usually host with PSA a political debate or dialogue. So folks that have suggestions for what that looks like come sort of July or August, we're keen to hear. Yes.
Does anyone else have anything? I'm just very. Is anything else that we haven't covered?
I'm already late, so I'm getting you worse than I've been yet.
How much time do we have, Lucy? We want to wrap up or?
Yeah, in the next part, it's kind of a little bit there, there's like 10 of the points, so we should probably give people a break.
Okay, cool.
Should I answer this one question first? Please,
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask about, so I know the original idea of the green paper was covering the CRIs, certain sections, certain bits, and it wasn't necessarily covering the universities, in particular how the universities are run. And you hinted at this in your presentation. Are you kind of dragging them in a bit because you're realizing that you can't do anything without them being involved?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to lift the universities out of the role of the universities play with the NZAS system. That's kind of how I see it. You know, once they feel like they contribute more, maybe to economic government. But you know, what we value in this country, whether it's the environment, whatever it might be. So how can we get more engaged with the private sector, with the CRIs, you know, vice versa? How do we get that knowledge exchange?
Any hint on the idea of putting a little bit of regulation about what they do and how they do it?
No, I mean, what they are doing is the education about how they handle education on their own. You know, so they are engaging. No, it's all around what's actually in that space. But a lot of the leaders sit outside of vote educationalists that the vote RSI that comes in. And so they need to say, yeah, let's look at the
I feel like you guys are not going to be able to really have a big impact on the workforce without that.
Yeah, exactly. You're just trying that. I agree. So,
Well, I think actually let's be blunt here. I mean, I think our role is more what I would call the Helen Kelly approach to unions, which is to be part of the society that actually creates solutions. And so somebody has to think what the solution is and what the current system looks like that the problem to be solved. Right now, one of the biggest problems to be solved when it comes to the staff is the PhD students don't have overhead against them. So they're actually tremendously subsidized in every Marsden, every MP Endeavor, every HRC cadet. And then they end up at the end of a PhD in the system competing against themselves for hyper-contestable funds. And yet a survey I believe says that most of them think they actually had a chance of staying in research for a career. And so being honest about it is one solution, actually changing the subsidies and the overhead so that we actually have low overhead fellowships as part of the system to get people through the first 5 to 10 years of the career. It's a really important part of the total
And incentives driving the university systems towards improving PhD qualifications, so people come out knowing more than academics.
And we should be creating a magnet for our national priorities for those fellowships, right? They should be supporting further students, so we have a sustainable system. Currently, it does not feel like that.
Maybe to wrap up, you could just say if you could, one students, and measure money's not just your vision. One to two students. And whoever wants to.
I really like focus scholarships, more of those.
Yeah, my ideal model for the science system is actually a sandwich where we favor collaboration throughout most of the system, and we have a little bit of competition in the middle for the fellowships that get you through your career, and at the very top for the national priorities that have to be funded by government.
Thanks, George. City.
Try to summarize, right?
Yeah, so I would just say that, something a little bit different, that we really need to take another look at IT. So the work that I have known before is, the method called genotype by sequencing, and it's all over the planet, and we specifically did not make that. It's flawed at Cornell University. When I got here at CRI, they wanted to have control over every little stupid incremental. Made no sense. A lot of friction in the system. Many of the public benefiting as much as possible. So we have to rethink about that.
And we just go for everything, but, yeah, right. Thank you.
Yeah, so just for everyone online, we're gonna take a 15-minute break and we start again at 11:30 with our preparatory and career pathway panel. And we're gonna do some shuffling around with the microphones in the meantime and hopefully get a little bit of sound for that panel. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. And then just. What I'm trying to do is
Hey, everybody, we're about to get started, so I'll have you anyone else paying attention? Very quickly.
I thought it was just going to be me.
It's not just going to be. Like this. Yeah. So we're just waiting on our final panelist, Georgia, who'll be with us in a second. And I'd like to welcome Kyle Hyam, who is zooming in for us all the way from Japan. So thank you very much, Kyle, for joining us both at a distance and at quite an early hour of your time.
Yes, thanks for the invitation. Hopefully the coffee kicks in soon.
Same for the rest of us, honestly. All right, we'll get started. So, kia ora, everybody who's here both physically and on our various online. My name is Dr. Lucy Stewart. I'm the co-president of the NZAS. I'm going to be chairing this panel today. The plan is that we're going to have probably about 50 minutes of discussion with the panelists, and then half an hour for some open audience discussion or questions from online too. We'll make sure we have someone monitoring the chat so it's easy for you guys to contribute questions. The purpose of this panel is to discuss sort of precarity and career pathways in science. So we have a group of early career researchers who come from a variety of backgrounds, institutions, and points in their career.
I love the name early career. It made me so good. Great for a Monday.
Just to give you a bit of background about myself as chair, so I am still technically an early career researcher myself. I'm 7 years out from my PhD. I was the co-chair of the Royal Society's early career group for 2 years. I've also been involved with some other early career groups around the country and sort of early career activism in general after returning to New Zealand in 2015 and doing my PhD in the US. But my purpose here is chiefly to keep the conversation going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves along the lines that I emailed them earlier. And we'll start with you, Kyle, since you're up there on screen.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, my name is Kyle Hyam. I'm a postdoc at the Institute of Innovation Research here at Hitotsubashi University in Japan. It's a very small social sciences focused university. I did my PhD in Victoria, and I completed at Victoria University, and moved to Switzerland shortly after that in 2019. So kind of got my foot in the door before everything kind of caught fire. I generally do sort of empirical research on innovation and meta science, and kind of study how knowledge moves around.
Great, thank you, Kyle. Laura.
Hi, I'm Professor Laura Bennett. Very, very early career, I consider. Every day I get up and I think, oh my God, I've got to learn something new to learn. So it's always good. I am current head of the Department of Physiology at the University of Auckland for my sins. I am a perinatal physiologist. That means I study biology of the physiology of babies before they're born. That's my specialist interest in preterm babies, trying to figure out how they grow and develop, what happens when things go horribly wrong, what can we do to develop diagnostic biomarkers and treatment strategies. And we span translational research into clinic and into bioengineering. I did my PhD at Auckland and went to University College London, but I've also spent time in Canada, in America, and Australia, just so I can talk a lot about their systems before coming back to Auckland's research team.
Georgia?
Kia ora koutou. My name is Georgia. I am, yes, very early career researcher. I handed in my PhD. I was writing up during the lockdowns, which was fun. But yeah, in my day job, I work at the Milligan Institute as a postdoctoral research fellow in cancer metabolism, pretty fundamental research, although the Milligan also does things like clinical trials. And recently I've sort of been segueing a little bit into the more engagement space, do a day a week as a Māori engagement advisor, which is a big title for just kind of talking to people and figuring out, okay, what do you think about this crazy sort of biotechnological thing that we're planning to do? And it's a really interesting sort of skill set, but I didn't really think I'd be qualified to do it until that happened. So that's that. And then also in my sort of hobby, I suppose, is being involved with NZAS and GFANs and also SCANS, so Communicators Association of New Zealand. So yeah, fingers in a lot of pies, and really passionate about advocating for research in New Zealand and how we can make it better.
Thanks, Georgia. So I'm Kate Lee. I'm also based at faculty, Medical and Health Sciences at Auckland. I'm early sort of creeping towards mid-career, as they like to call it. I've been out, I did my PhD in London and graduated in 2010, and then left academia because I thought it was too horrible. And I worked in, I was a lab manager for a few years, so I was very good at organizing things. So I was a lab manager for nearly a year, and then I ended up, I came to New Zealand, and luckily I found a postdoctoral research position that was really interesting, and that's when my career started as in research. And the thing that I really found was I was a bit lost and a bit lonely, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I mean, I knew what I was doing in the lab, but I didn't really know what I was doing in terms of the rest of the system. And I didn't really feel like there was very good mentoring coming down to me. And I turned around, looked at the people around me, and I found there was the same problem around me, and lots of people felt the same. And so we set up a postdoctoral group. This was at the School of Biological Sciences. And then after a couple of years, I moved over to the faculty, and we started a postdoctoral group there as well. And at the same time, there were postdoctoral groups starting to crop up everywhere, because this had obviously reached ahead, and people were looking around going, you know, we're not being supported, we're lost off the system, we don't count in the HR systems and the universities in which we work. And I think that's been a really amazing revolution of being able to give, not just supporting each other and setting up some of those career development systems that we all need, and attracting some funding to be able to do that, but also just providing a voice for early career researchers and putting our view forward to policymakers.
So kia ora koutou, ko whainui te waka, ko ngāti mane poto te iwi. Te whānau mai au ki o Poriki, kakiki mai au ki o Poriki ki Rotorua. Te rangahau me ruruhu rangatahi o ki Ag Research. Ko Louise Hennessy tōku ingoa. Kia ora. Louise, I grew up in Portahi and Rotorua, and then I went to study at the University of Waikato for my Bachelor of Science. After I completed that, I was lucky enough to get a Māori summer internship at Ag Research, and I just never really left, to be honest. I've been associated with Ag Research for about 10 years. I went on to do my master's and then my PhD through Ag Research, the Fire Protection Research Centre at Lincoln University. Yeah, finished my PhD in 2020. I studied insects and the behaviour of insects. Yeah, 2020 was an interesting time, I guess. But I was lucky enough in 2021 to be employed at Ag Research as a scientist and early career ambassador. So I have a split role where I spend 50% of my time studying insects and the other 50% of my time managing our Māori internship programs, which is quite fun. It's kind of come full circle, and I just love working with the next generation of Māori researchers. It's really inspiring. And also I helped establish our Ag Research Early Career Group last year, and I now co-chair the Royal Society Early Career Forum as of a couple of months.
Thanks everybody for those introductions. The first topic I'd like you to all talk about, and I guess we could just maybe go around in the same order, but also if you want to have a little discussion, feel free to do that. Is you've all told us kind of your backgrounds and how you got into research, but we know kind of both anecdotally and from statistics like that great report that Troy pointed out for us this morning that's looking at academic publications, that most people do leave research after they do their PhDs. Most people don't stay. So I wonder if all of you could talk a bit like about why you've stayed in research for however long you've been in research, and what excites you and motivates you to keep sticking to this. And we'll start with you again, Kyle.
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I have had the privilege of kind of being unanchored to any particular place, and so we just decided to use my PhD to try and live in interesting places and travel while we could. Obviously, COVID put a little bit of a damper on that, but in general, I have enjoyed working with great people and have had almost complete freedom within my research projects to study whatever I want to do. And I would just like to continue down this pathway because I've had a good experience so far. In terms of what I find sort of exciting and motivating about research, I would say that sort of hearing about my work being taught in universities or used by policymakers always gives me a little rush. So I like to think that my work is important. I think we all do, but I think I have a kind of a high bar for validation that this work actually has an impact outside of academia, whether that's a reasonable bar to have or not. So that's always really motivating, seeing impact outside of academia. And of course, the other aspect is that I just really like working with other people, and so I think I've been surrounded by just really good people who just understand the importance of being surrounded by other good people. So once you find yourself in a kind of network of people like that, where people motivate each other, support each other, and know that people always come first before any professional responsibilities, it's kind of hard to leave behind. And so that's kind of been a real sticking factor for me in my research.
And Kyle, so you're based in Japan. Are you kind of able to see the use of your research where you are, or is that mostly associated with the research you did in New Zealand?
No, so I mean, I've only been in Japan for about 2 years now. So I like to think that I've had an impact among academics in Japan, but I haven't seen it used outside. Mostly my research, though, I still collaborate very frequently with my collaborators in Europe and in New Zealand. And so no, while I'm physically based in Japan, the impact of my research hasn't really the scope of that hasn't really changed very much.
Oh, thank you. Laura, so do you want to start with the ECR, MCR, and then I'll just give you the weird story again.
All right, well, then we'll start with Louise.
Now I've lost track of the question. It was why you say
Why you do this research and what you find exciting and motivating about your research period?
I've always loved learning stuff. Throughout high school, I just love science because I just love learning new stuff at the time. Which gets me beyond the research. So that's how I got into science. I had no idea what scientists in New Zealand actually do or what a career in science looks like. Followed my passion for it. Yes, that's how I can imagine staying in it for the rest of my career. But I'm only a couple of years post PhD at this point. But I have a lot of hope for the future and the science system in the future. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a nerd like most of us, and I really like getting in the lab and doing science, and then love PCR drew me into and so I love that. But the key thing that really motivates me and gets me out of bed in the morning is just that gaining knowledge in my field. There's going to be a health impact. It might not be an immediate impact, so a lot of what I do is basic science, but a lot of what we're researching is definitely going to have an impact on human health in the future in terms of studying metabolic disease, which underpins all the other diseases. So that's my driver, and that's why I get out of bed in the morning, and and I think that's what makes the job really exciting. All the other stuff is the issues are the things that might interfere with that, but they haven't yet outweighed my love for what I do. And so yeah, I think that's the reason why, and the reason I'm still here really is because I've just been lucky. And that's the thing that annoys me as well, is because the only reason that I'm here and I do this job still is because I've been lucky. I've happened to have scored a couple of grants at some point, which seems sometimes to be more of a ball being drawn out of a hat than it does to do with the quality of the research. And that's just because there's not enough money in the pot. And then, and also because I have to work for, my boss has been quite good at getting hold of money and keeping me going as well. And that's not the case for lots of other really amazing scientists that have slipped through the cracks. Just imagining slipping through a crack.
Yeah, no, it's pretty similar story to other people. I wasn't sure that I wanted to do science, but I knew that I wanted to kind of solve problems, and I love puzzles and things like that. And my undergrad degree was in biotech and also politics as well, just a side major. So I'm kind of bored. I realized as I went along, I was actually a lot more interested in the meta question of how science runs, really. But for now, I'm doing basic research. Have sort of kind of gone from topic to topic. My honors was more neuroscience based, and then I went to cancer metabolism, and it's kind of just been luck as well, and sort of networking with people. And COVID was also kind of had a silver lining in that my current boss had money and didn't have the ability to bring in anyone from overseas, and I was sort of just sitting there and was planning to travel after my PhD, but obviously that wasn't going to happen. So it's like, okay, well, let's stick here for now. But yeah, I am in the process of probably disappearing down a crack. I've got a year left on my research, and I'm still in research because of luck, and I think it's partially that, and also partially because I've grown to know myself that I don't think it's exactly for me. But I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, like falling through the crack, what's underneath the crack. Okay, this metaphor's going a little off the rails. But yeah, I really think I have the stamina. I'm choosing to, and publish or perish, I'm choosing to slowly perish, and also kind of segue to more science policy and science communication, because actually finding out about other people's research and looking for the similarities and differences and asking questions about what we value in science is actually much more interesting to me than, even though PCI is great and I love it, I'm kind of sick of designing primers and stuff like that. I think I've got the skills, but I'm slowly backing away from it. But yeah, that's what I'm at. Sorry if that's too much of a negative answer.
No, it's a scope for what I'm talking about. Wow. When I was at primary school, only yesterday, I was very lucky to be exposed to really good science teachers. I think one of the things that we need in a very disconnected system that we have that is recognizing that if you want to capture STEM science, you do it early on and you keep it going. And it was the time of the Apollo missions. It never occurred to me at any time in my primary school years that I couldn't do any of that. And as a woman, that I couldn't do anything like that. Until I went to high school. And then high school's curriculum for science wasn't great, not great teachers. And I said, I wanted to be an astronaut. They went, that's just stupid. So dial it down. Okay, well, maybe I need some training. I'll be a pilot. In those days, a woman could not be a commercial pilot. It wasn't that long ago. So how about you, I don't know, get some secretarial skills and then you'll get to 19 or 20 and then you'll get married. That was my career advice. Well, the important thing about being a scientist is that you have to be bloody minded. Because I thought, no one in my family had ever gone to university. I'll go to university. But it wasn't to do science because I'd been turned off by science. It was to do history, politics, and psychology because I had a really, really good history teacher who taught me how to think, taught me how to write, taught me not to believe any facts unless I had proven that those were facts, because the history is always written by the winners, right? And so I went to university and did all those sorts of things and did more psychology because you only have to look at the news to realize that understanding psychology might help you understand some of our leaders and what they're doing. I got interested in brain injury. I was offered a master's in those days, young rugby players were not wearing helmets and things like that. Concussion, rugby unions weren't really acknowledging it. And then I got a phone call one day and they said, and get my grant, so bye. And I lost that. And then somebody else said, oh, they're doing something up weird in the medical school with young minds, turned out to be fetuses, so yeah, really young. And it was like, I could do this. I like you guys. It was like, this is amazing. And the discovery, the knowledge, the curiosity is the thing that drives me. And then you have to have a bloody mindedness on top of that to understand that the landscape in wherever we are cannot sustain our dreams in the way that we want them to do. And to actually go away from the concept of ivory tower to actually understanding that it's a science, is a business. And I really would like my grants to be in my local ASB account so I knew what it was. I could give me the bill, I'll pay it kind of thing. And that's part of the transitioning that we need to talk about. But what keeps me up on Monday morning, well, 7 o'clock flights, and thank you for the invite, it's marvelous to come down, is I do think we can make a difference. And I see the translation in my field that I've got a mum in front of me who's lost their baby at 39 weeks, they're stillborn, died before it was their chance to be born. I mean, one of those tragic things you can have in your life. Or the mum who's, mum and dads who've delivered a preterm baby. And I think, yeah, I can make the next treatment for that. In fact, our group has in fact developed the first treatment for brain damage in babies. And we're on to the next 2 plus a diagnostic biomarker that we will take to market. And I don't know that I'll patent it. I just want it out there as real knowledge and to encourage people to be participants in their own health, to have that feedback with them and public engagement. And to make that dream happen, you have to do the hard yards and reframe it, I think, the scientific landscape so that we identify a crack, that we pave over it, we find the structural integrity of it to give people the opportunity to explore, because science isn't just the white lab coat pipetting things. If you were to ask people what a scientist is, it's the white lab coat, it's the boiling liquid, the colored liquid and the pipetting of things. When we had our physiology floor redeveloped, they put all this glass up. It was like, well, we can't hang anything on the walls now. And they goes, yes, but as an architect, I like to stand here and see all the people pipetting things. And I know that I have done my job. That's to be a prime example of disconnect between science and policy. Just so. Anyway, so I get up in the morning because I do know that I can see those mums and I can talk to them and can make a difference. And I can take the next generation of scientists through with that. Because that's where it started, was at primary school. Look to stars. Anyway, that's a strange story.
No, that's good. I do have to know the glass wall story. I heard that at so many institutions. Like, I don't know what it is about
There's one at
architects,
Thick as
but
well.
yeah, they want to be able to see it and we want to actually do some science.
Well, somewhere you can put something on the wall.
Maybe we should just buy those goldfish balls that they can have in their own houses. So they can
To be fair, I've been through a couple of architects' offices, and they do have a lot of glass, so they are practicing.
No privacy screening. Anybody comes to you in tears or anything, it's like, or you could just schedule a meeting where, no, yeah, because that's what's going to happen. Anyway, that's
Anyway, so kind of leading on from that, I think the thing I'd like to ask you or talk about next is then, you know, you've stayed in research, you've been scientists, at any point, like, George has talked about this a bit, and Laura's talked about this a bit, what else have you or would you consider doing? And how well do you feel the science within your training has kind of supported you to make active career decisions about where you go with your expertise?
Not really.
Not really. Right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, the thing is, yeah, the PhD in most instances these days is designed to build academic researchers. And we all know there's a huge number of people being trained with PhDs. There's very few places in academic research, and it's a huge failing because the universities are, the whole purpose is to train the future workforce. And all they're doing is propping up the research funding with a low paid, cheap labour workforce. And it's not doing the students any favours. It's not doing the system any favours because you're training people up and losing them. And it's not even the intended outcome. It's an accidental outcome from the way the funding is structured. And so, yeah, we need to think about quantity of PhD students we train, how we train them for other things. How do we do joint courses where we can, you know, people can do part PhD, part internships, part PhD, part economics or something else that's going to help them get out into the world and do different things. One of the things that we did as the postdoc society is we run alternative careers, although obviously the alternative careers are not the thinker, it's and I personally organized loads of these, and I've had all sorts of amazing people come in that sort of did a PhD and then moved on to something else, because some of them went on to do other things on purpose, you know, with the intention, and some people fell through the cracks and happened to find something else on the other side that luckily was great for them. And I've had loads of people come in and talk to us about their amazing careers. And I personally, and a few other people that I know, still have no idea what we did if we fell through the crack. So I think, yeah, there's obviously some people who can go on and do something else and find a way. But it would help some sleepless nights if I knew how to write. You know, what would I be doing if I wasn't doing that?
you want to do what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
So in fact, the system is wrong, that we can't support the people who want to do the cracks, as you say, because there's a disconnect between PhDs, and there's a PhD mill in most universities, and New Zealand's just really start to ramp up on it with money, buddy. And then you come into a career structure which really has no fellowships. We have dotted fellowships here. We should have fellowships right through to senior, like we do overseas, that you actually have the opportunity to be able to have security in your funding, independent. If you're going to develop as an independent person, then you need to be able to gain this. We need a lot more bulk funding there. And the other thing we don't have is a transition from fellowships into university systems. So we do put in place lots of opportunities to train people and mentor people and all the rest of it. We mentor people so well that they've got an associate professor and their fixed term staff, because it's like, well, I see no ships kind of thing. And we don't say, okay, we promoted that person because we think they're brilliant. 100 papers, stick them into the system, and that's what you're paying your own salary. That's awesome. But that person's being paid off part FTE here on a grant, part on a program grant, and if any one of those fall over. And that's one of the things we're starting to see, is we're starting to see people working on reduced FTE as a normal occurrence. because we have a capped budget system, which if you take an HRC project grant or even master, you have a capped budget, which must include massive overhead. You have incremental steps in fellow 1, fellow 2, fellow 3, which often are more than 3%, but we cap at 3% of total. So by the time you've gone through that and you have a general pay award, go the unions, then you're well over any cap that's actually within the funding mechanism. And we now can't afford to pay people's salaries properly. The only way where that comes off is the bottom line, because we lost the tripartite system that we had in the 1990s, early 2000s, where any shortfall would then be made up through government mechanisms. And so we've got lots of those kind of weird things. We've got no ability to really independently work, and even within a grant, we can't. And it's just like, crazy. This is where we've got to.
What other job says like, oh great, congratulations, you're hired, go find your pay? Like, what? If you tell people that aren't in the research system, they're like, are you sure you got that right? Like, how much do you get paid for every paper you get published? And you're like, oh, no.
Just a question. So you just discussed the reduction in FTE, but that's really about pay, right? Not about actually how much FTE of effort.
Oh, no.
Right? And I think that's an important
mechanism,
point, right? So how many of you or any of us in this room spend more time working than our FTEs add up?
Oh yeah,
That's not even an unnatural situation for us, right?
But I think it's an important point to note, because if you were in almost any other job, you would be getting paid overtime, or you would have, and this is an anomaly in some ways.
You can't get promoted unless you teach.
That's
But
right.
we're teaching for free if you're a fixed term
Yeah.
research. And I'm talking about universities, and that's my experience, not anything else. So that's free labor. I've been helping the PhD students in our institution fight to get that incremental step up, and they will get that next year. It's not going to be equity across the board, that's another issue. But if you look at models overseas, we value our PhDs as part of the workforce. They do that job. Yes, they're in training, but if they're an apprentice, you would be getting paid. And there are models overseas that look at funding structures that are more like a pay structure, which then actually, yeah, absolutely. So, and that works very well, that you're going through that process. Yes, and this is where, if we're talking about trying to get the GDP percentage up for science, this is what the ministers need to understand, is that we don't have salary structure right. We don't have the incremental steps and the security in that. Not everyone who's PhD is meant to be a scientist in the system, but we have career pathways, and we are now strengthening those to partnership. But I remember in the 1990s, it was like, one of the reasons we had that step down in that funding, that fell, because we lost things like the NERF fund. So I remember I spent more than 18 months trying to get the National Economic Research Fund, or whatever it was called today, because we had a pipeline to industry. And they just, oh no, we're frozen that now, we're thinking about it. And then it's like, we'll cancel it. And that was around about that time. So those pipelines, as was the phrase in those days, through, meant that we lost our economic partners that would help pay. And now we're being told we should be partnered up constantly, and our PhD students, 50% university, 50% partner. What does this mean? Someone's made policy without even talking to the police. So I'm talking too much, but that's the framework that I see. How about Japan?
Yeah, Japan's an interesting place for academia. The postdocs are generally capped at 2 years. So you don't really have a choice but to move on. But also there are just so many universities and so many positions available. They obviously place a very, very high weight on education here, and university education in particular. The vast majority of people go to university, and it's if you don't mind like the prestige of the university you go to, then it's pretty straightforward to find a sort of assistant professor position, which they kind of adopted the tenure track system that the US and Europe have, but there is kind of an expectation that you will be made permanent. It's quite a low bar to stay on that track. So that's nice. It kind of gives the universities a reason to not renew the contracts of the really poorly performing academics. I feel like in New Zealand, the universities aren't even willing to take the risk in the first place. And I'm actually coming back to New Zealand very soon. on Wednesday, actually, I'm moving back to New Zealand. So I want to come back, and I don't want to stay in the system here. I think there are lots of people in my position that want to come back, but there's just nothing there for us. So I'm taking up a position at Motu, like a local economic research institution in Wellington. There's no work in the universities. I have been looking out for the last 2 years, but there's just nothing there. So I've managed to find a nice position at this institute in Wellington, and so even though it's much easier to find a kind of nice, sort of, not cushy, but it's a more stable position here in Japan, I would much rather take a precarious position in New Zealand. And I think maybe policymakers don't really see academics working outside of New Zealand as a potential pool of applicants. They see the people they're training up, and then they leave the country and then forget about them.
It's a really interesting parallel that he's pointed out. You know, in Japan, Kyle's pointed out there's a lot of universities, there's a lot of institutions, there's a lot of people who will pay for the money. So there's a lot more institutions, there's a lot more work, there's a lot more potential, just due to scale. Obviously, I did my PhD in London. There's lots of universities, lots of research going on in the UK and in London in particular for high concentration. And quite a few people that were doing PhDs around the same time as me walked into faculty positions because that's what they could do. And in the States as well, there's a lot of issues with working conditions in the States, but there's a lot of institutions around. And we've got to remember in New Zealand, there's just not that many places. It's an issue of scale. But at the same time, there are a lot of people here doing science. And then we're being requested that we should be going overseas if we can't, oh well, if you don't like the charity, you should go over to the States, you should go over this. And there's no recognition of the fact that many of us have maybe not gone immediately from school to master's to PhD and into work. And we're not young. I wasn't young when I started my postdoctoral career, so we're turning around and a lot of people, when I'm also at the Morris Wilkins Centre, and we've managed to expand and recruit a whole bunch of Māori and Pacific researchers as well that have come in onto the committee. We've gone around trying to find a handful of people who do this molecular biology type research around the country. And a lot of them have done really circuitous routes in their careers, very different routes from the classic routes as well. And they're all still being hit with the stick of you need to go overseas. Well, actually, I've got family, I've got kids, I've got to think about schools, and there's no recognition of that either.
When I finished my PhD, I actually thought of it as a fake pathway. Often what was being promoted is that you do your PhD in New Zealand and you go overseas for a couple of years and do a postdoc, and then you'll come back to New Zealand for this job opportunity. Which I just couldn't see existing, and you just didn't see advertisements for junior scientist roles in New Zealand. So promoting this weird we just need more pathways, and when you're coming up through the system, a better understanding of what you can do with a PhD, and that it's not failure if you don't become a scientist in a CRI or you university that pathway as well. There are all these different alternative options for a PhD graduate. And it wasn't until I finished my PhD, because obviously I'd gone 10 years thinking I would be a scientist in a lab, and do that for the rest of my career until I finished, that I was like, wow, there's actually some other opportunities that you could do more through the bank, but quite interesting, exciting opportunities. So just need a better understanding of those pathways and things to support us getting into those different.
Reflecting on the conversations we had earlier, it strikes me we've put a huge investment into training people, PhDs and postdocs. And for those of us who are running a lab, there's a need for a critical mass that you don't have to keep training again and again and again, that you're building that knowledge. But there's all these other areas that we've been talking about, that add value to what we're doing, either at the kind of work that I do, but I also do work with commercial partners. We're trying to go into biotechnology a lot more because I want some wearable biotechnology, just in case anybody's into that, see me. And those are the pathways that I would like. It's just not the university. Don't get depressed about that. There are these other opportunities with add value in education, but be partnered with. If we want to change Aotearoa New Zealand's science platform for what we see as specific, many of us do global research, but there are many specific issues here. You need to have that whole ecosystem, and that's another disconnect for me. And we don't have that. Just like bye bye.
And it's unique. New Zealand's unique in the sense of its scale and things as well. So I feel like this is a place where we shouldn't be perhaps just doing things differently to America, because we're not America.
Oh, please, yes.
On that note, I think we had a question from Troy to get asked how to talk about the Swiss system a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Swiss system, someone else mentioned there's a lot of money in the Swiss system. There is certainly a lot of money in the Swiss system. PhDs are salaried employees of the university. They get all the health benefits and pension, all that stuff, and they get paid a decent wage as well. The Swiss system is also very competitive. There are many more universities than there are in New Zealand, despite a relatively small difference in our populations. They have a huge number of international students going there. Especially PhD students, because of the attractiveness of the salary, the sort of the stable income, and all the benefits that come with it. They also offer things like mobility scholarships for postdocs, where they're relatively competitive, but they allow you to basically earn a Swiss salary overseas and go work in a foreign institution for 2 or 3 years, maybe up to 4 years, I think, with the expectation that you would come back to Switzerland and take up a assistant professor position. And I think there are probably a lot more early career positions, like tenure track positions. They have a very strong tenure track system where most people, I don't think, make tenure, but you have 6 years to do that. So at least it's a little less precarious. However, there's not much in the way of teaching responsibilities as well. So there's a lot of money in the system, and it doesn't have to scale with the number of students that need teaching, right? People can do research, and that scales in as much as you want it to. So assistant professors work for 6 years, mostly on research. They might teach 1 or 2 classes a year, and that's it. So they just simply invest a lot more money in their scientists, and if their assistant professors don't need to teach as much, that is perfectly fine. They can do research as well.
So kind of bouncing off this discussion of international moves and so on, I'd like people to kind of think about, we know that New Zealand is at this nexus of this kind of global research system, and people are constantly moving in and out, and there's always been this expectation that people have voiced. I definitely have experience that you must go overseas to be employable in New Zealand, which obviously presents huge equity barriers for lots of people. What I'm interested in hearing you guys talk about is how well do you think we manage this global interface? How do you think it would be better managed? And Louise and Georgia in particular, if you want to, and you don't have to, I'm curious to know how you guys think that it faces with our, Te Reo or Waitangi responsibilities, and the need to integrate that into the New Zealand research system. If you have a very large number of people kind of moving overseas into the system, how do we balance that out, and how do we make that work? I know.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that with again, with the expectation that you move overseas, obviously not everyone is young and childless and can just, live in a studio apartment for forever.
And in fact, I will interject quickly. I was just scrolling through that paper again, Toilet Plus 2, and the data from that paper shows that 50% of PhD graduates in New Zealand are over the age of 35.
Yeah, exactly, right. So obviously that's a big barrier that you can't just uproot. Some people do it and it's huge hassle, I know. But then again, also, I was thinking about it from the perspective of a Māori or even like a Pacific scientist, where it's like, especially in the social scientist areas, you might have research that is very specific to New Zealand, and you still get this thing like, oh, you have to go overseas. Like, well, where I'm trying to go to more towards Māori engagement and stuff, that's not a thing that I would be doing overseas. So there is that disconnect, right? It's like, if you are studying something that is like, for instance, the ecology of Aotearoa, like how does that connect with you still have to go overseas to be considered employable, even if your research and your personal feelings are that you find to stay, but it's just there's not opportunity. So and then I suppose the other side of it is international students coming in. I know that some people like to divide and conquer a little bit. I feel like about Māori students and international students, especially like seeing some chatter, an increase in international students being at the expense of Māori students. I don't think that's the case at all. It's like we're all in the same boat, right? We're all struggling to do our research in this space. And I think I feel for a lot of our international students when they come in and they're expected to work in the system, and it's like, obviously having Te Tiriti embedded research, it's hugely important, but nobody's telling them that. And so, especially with this role I've had this year, I've had my workmates kind of come up to me and almost like whisper, like, I don't know what this means. Sorry, I wasn't projecting. I whispered, I don't know what this means. They want to do the right thing, but nobody's telling them. There's no some institutes have kind of put together some sort of courses and stuff, but there's no sort of nationwide thing saying, hey, FYI, you come to Aotearoa, you brought your skills in, great, thank you. This is the context that we're working in. This is what you need to be aware of. So we're all on the same page. This is how you write a grant, which gives proper, not just the vision mātauranga box ticking where you've called up the Māori and you've said, hey, does my grant look good? Thanks, bye. Like,
We have moved a little bit.
We have moved a little bit beyond that. But some people have moved a little bit beyond that. But also there's people keep getting told, it's like, oh, this isn't good enough. And like, okay, I know it's not good enough now, but what's the next step? There's no protocol for things like Māori engagement. And so this is sort of what I'm trying to make up as I go along, and talking to other people and saying, oh, nobody really kind of knows how to do this right. And if they do, they haven't told everyone else. So
well, there is no right. It's an evolutionary story.
Yeah.
And we're all on that journey.
Yeah.
We're lucky if we can find a waka to put our foot in. That's where we're at right now. But we definitely need to take our international students there. And that's part of the matrix of being part of the family that was a science group. Take them through.
Yeah. And I think the fundamental problem for coming from the Māori perspective is just there's not enough of us. I'm not really I spend all my time feeling like I'm not qualified, really, because I'm just fresh out of a PhD and my qualifications are being Māori and being interested in policy. But it's like, I'm constantly having to manually look for mentors and stuff in that space, because you're just making it up as we go along. So we just needs more people in the system, because then it's that double shift, right? Like then we wouldn't feel like I was being burnt out just trying to do the bare minimum. you know, and try to do the right thing.
I would just say that I've seen multiple Māori and Pacifica PhD students graduate unable to move overseas due to family or community commitments, and they're just being lost to the science system. That's even when the science system is screaming out for more Māori and Pacifica in science, which seems crazy. Hopefully the times are starting to change a little bit. Usually I hear it from the older generation of scientists that, you know, that's the pathway, you must go overseas and gain that experience.
It's interesting you're saying this. That's not my understanding about it anymore. I mean, I've raised my own PhDs who did not go overseas because the landscape had actually changed. They've been very successful. They've got fellowships, now associate professors, all kinds of stuff. You know, that I don't think is a strong mandate anymore. And I think certainly with understanding New Zealand's necessity of its own work, I think that we will see less pressure on that. So it's interesting that you're feeling that, or you're hearing that.
It's fading a little bit, but it's still, I don't know, you might be more of a minority than you think about having that attitude.
It's interesting. So certainly you need to push back on that to say, and to put it in the context that you beautifully just said. And it is an equity issue to be able to go overseas and find a place. That doesn't mean that you can't then travel for 6 months and do you want, you know, to have.
I certainly had that when we run sort of, you know, out of postdoc kind of events, and we've got senior staff in over the last however long 10 years I've been doing this. That has this message about going overseas has been there, but it's been with this concept of you know, somebody who's like quite young, just popping out through the system, and you know, it doesn't.
Oh, we have to work on that because I don't agree with it. I think that you can take your opportunities which fit, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't nurture those who choose not to take that route at that time. It doesn't mean that they will. And people travel internationally for meetings and conferences and work with people. And science is about the people and the ideas, not the tech. With all due respect to your BCRs. That's a method and a toy, and it's a, you know, science is about the people. They generate the ideas. And that's the crux of it. If you do not have that pipeline to.
I don't think we fundamentally disagree.
No, right through. But I'm just interested because I had certainly, and maybe it's just a department of physiology thing on the School of Faculty of Medical Health Sciences, but we've gone away from that for some time now.
It's definitely an option not to go overseas. It's just I do agree with what you say. It's like it's not so much that you can't stay here, it's that you don't know that that is an option. Like when everyone senior above you and you're just sort of like a lowly PhD student, and if you haven't investigated, like actually gone out of your way to network and contact people that have these quote unquote alternative careers, then you just think, oh, well, I guess that's what I'm doing. Then that's what my supervisor does. That's what my collaborator does. And we don't actually tell the PhD students that there's an option.
So how do we fix that knowledge gap? Talk about the postdoctoral society, which is amazing work on getting that kind of stuff up and running. If it's not your mentors or supervisors or your fellow colleagues telling you, how do you see that gap being filled?
Kyle, quickly, you know, as someone who is overseas, did you feel that pressure, or was it just as you were discussing, you and your wife thought this is our opportunity?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean, it was both, I think. The opportunity to take up a postdoc overseas actually came before I finished my PhD, so I kind of just jumped on that and didn't really think about it twice. I always wanted to travel and live overseas for a while, so it was kind of just being able to work and do research at the same time was a privilege that I just didn't want to pass up. Yeah.
So you're kind of in some ways the classic person for whom the system is working the way it's expected to work because it was in the right time to do it. It was what it wanted.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Come back. Sure. So that's the dichotomy is that, you know, people are being said, you know, there's one message saying you should perhaps go overseas to get the experience and then bring it back, but then there's no mechanism to bring people back.
Yeah. So I will say when I decided my PhD overseas, like Kyle, I was really excited to, you know, get out of New Zealand for a bit. My wife was able to come with me, so it all worked out. But when I came back, I started getting in touch with people I knew to say, so how do I get a job in New Zealand? And several of them actually said, oh, really, Nisha, have you considered staying and postdocing overseas some more to prove that, you know, you've got the overseas experience? And I was like, I'm just for 5 years.
There isn't a mechanism, it's good luck. You have to find.
Because they were trying to tell you that there weren't any opportunities and don't have that good.
I mean, these were professional contacts, these are kind of personal contacts, so they were trying to be kind and supportive, but
I've had people saying that I should go overseas. Okay.
But to get back to Laura's point now, how do we kind of transmit that institutional knowledge better? Because I think this is something we do. I have heard as I've done ECR activism over the last 5 years. We hear that a lot from institutions. They're like, oh yes, we think that there should be this institutional knowledge transfer because the PhD students just don't understand what they're getting into. But I don't know. I feel like I'm not seeing institutions much take up the responsibility.
Yeah, it's not the PhD students' fault. Like,
Yeah.
gosh, they just want to do some good science. And yeah.
But that comes as a framework of career development. A couple of years ago, I was told by a professional staff member that they'd had a hui on academic career development. And I thought, great. And so who were the academics on it? No academics. So no academics were harmed in the making of a strategy meeting about career development for academics. It was all professional staff. Yes. And what we should take home message? What should 25 words list? I was expecting them to say precarity and salaries and no pathways and no fellowships and no transition to university, tenure posts and all the rest of it. And their solid thing was we need a coordinated plan of mentoring. So they're seeing, and I think sometimes when you read the stuff about occurs to universities or institutions or government, when they're saying workforce development, they mean modules that you can go on to train to do something. Not we're going to understand from primary school, get the kids into STEM. Are we going to get Māori Pacifica kids into university? How do we engage in whānau and accepting that? And then have the strategy of actually understanding what a PhD is. It's not indentured servitude. It really is. It is, in fact, absolutely vital part of our matrix. Then what do you do with the postdocs? What are their opportunities? Going overseas, one of them, keeping in the systems out, what skills are we trying to retain? How do they see their career development? It's not for everyone. And then how do they progress through fellowships and the like, so that you can actually see the pathway to being a professor.
Yeah.
And not seeing that dropping out and not coming back into a system that goes, oh, who are you again? Is the same.
I think it would just be really good as well for postdocs to, again, and I don't know how much they've been doing this again, but really trying to push for that sort of training, training how to do things outside of academia. And that really, it's not being done as part of the PhD. We need to be making sure all these new people coming through
they will do that. They will still not pay you though.
So that's anything I do for all the ECR.
Yeah, how about we treat that as part of career, the job, right? The job that you enjoy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting on COVID lockdown. One of the very first things the head of department was like, right, who are we going to sack? Got to cut our budgets because we're going to go into debt. And I'm thinking, well, 73% of my staff in my department are on fixed contracts. You can't, this big list, you can't sack these people. Yes, but money, saving money, don't go to all the grants. You do not pay for these people. But who are we going to sack? No, well, other than yourself. I mean, really, it really taught me the university does not know its own business.
No.
Or I think that the governments don't understand what the universities or other, what does science actually look like at the coalface? How does it work as a business module? How do we pay and support people who actually then get the depth of knowledge? Because that's actually what critical mass is about, to take you in those innovative steps, not like the HRC or other funding agencies say, a good idea, I wanted a phase 1 clinical trial by the end of 3 years, which is where the pressure is. You see it in Australia with the NHMRC, where career fellows like you have nothing if you haven't published at least 10 papers before you get up. And then that's just that year kind of thing. And your idea has to be translatable, have impact, and it's just insane that we look at science that way. There are practical parts of science, there are blue skies. We do not want to see the investigator-led science disappear, and yet we're seeing it because we have an idea that big institute is the place where good science is done. Actually, if you go back and you look at it, the critical mass of scientists in a group, think about your support staff out there, is no more than 3 single people. postdocs and senior staff, because they're the ones who are generating policy. So there's lots of work done on that. And then you build that with support mechanisms of the students and the technical staff, not on 0.5 FTE, which I just, adopt for someone. It's just ridiculous.
It's interesting you point out that idea of, when COVID came round and they were looking for people to sack, and then they realised most of their workforce were fixed term contracts, sort of part funded here and then by grants. And I don't know what it's like at the CRIs, whether the fixed term contracts, what proportion of the staff are on fixed term contracts. I'm assuming there's a chunk. And certainly in our faculty, it's actually, when they've done the maths, it's loads of people.
Yes, in science and
then the universities say they cannot take the hit on the that they can't take the risk of potentially not having the money to be able to employ any of those people permanently. They can't take the risk, and yet at all times they are constantly employing at least 170 people in our faculty on fixed term contracts, which is something like a third of the academic research staff, or more even, potentially. I'm not sure, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. It's a big number.
And I think it's actually, in terms of our employment law, I think there's actually a good question as to the kind of long-term legality of that, because, fixed term contracts, you're supposed to have a, reasonable change. Yeah, so yes, I know one person who
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
one university had 80 separate fixed term
80.
contracts. Yes, 80. This was over about 10 years.
I just wanted to address what Kate was asking. So like 5 weeks before I left my job at the CRI, there was a big science meeting where they had a whole bunch of postdocs and PhD students present their work, right? And then a strategy session with the international advisors. At that meeting, they announced that the strategy was to run the science by PhD students and postdocs, fixed term.
Yeah.
That's it, not real permanent positions. That's been, some years ago now. But the callousness of that announcement in that context to that audience that you won't have a job
Yeah,
just made me nauseous.
yeah. I feel like it's accidental almost in academia potentially, with the way the funding system is so much underpinned by contestable money. But that sounds like it's very much on purpose.
I think it's developed that way for us too. It's a cheap model. There's no doubt about that. The university doesn't have to pick up on it, or the institutions don't have to pick up on it. But it isn't sustainable. And we actually talk about the thing that we're here for. It's not just the careers, it's actually the science and the quality of the science and the ability to grow science and not split your attention again. It's like you're going to go out to commercial practice and all the rest of it. Well, maybe that's your way. You can do that. Might not be, but you can't do that unless if you want to have it, from New Zealand. Otherwise, I remember we were going through an exercise about 5 years ago where it was like, we'll have to make a decision about science and we aren't going to fund. We can't pay for everything. And we'll just purchase science off the shelf overseas, part of the HRC's refresh strategy. And then we will be able to apply it, because that's what you do without scientific workforce being trained to do this or to expand it. And that kind of, it just beggars belief that you can actually have that kind of concept, and that wouldn't be cherry picked what you were going to do. And then you just grow scientists to fit that mold, because COVID is not a thing. Who knew we would have to be prepared for such a thing? Well, everybody, but nonetheless. And it's not an easy fix, but I do think we've broken it quite significantly right now, that we can actually at least scaffold it to come back into something that is sustainable, because that's the thing that we're supposed to be. If you want to grow the dynamics of science into the translation, whatever else you want to do to fix New Zealand's problems and the world's problems, with a really good scientific workforce, get bloody good scientists. We do it on the snip of an oily rag. But the whole capping of budgets right now, we haven't had a rise in that for a long time. We are not, maybe we need to relook at whoever sat on a panel and had an overseas person going, how much are you paying in overheads? Why is this grant 1.2 million? What's the salaries? What's this other number? Do we need to block fund our universities in a different way, or our institutions in a different way? So you bring back grants to being just the science and the people, and make it, sustainable for that point.
Yeah, 100%. We just talked about the human payment for this precarity, but actually, I was saying before, the way this runs means that we're just excuse my French, but just pissing money down the drain in terms of money that we're spending on training, equipment. You know, it's just so inefficient, which is a massive waste of taxpayers' money. All the efficiencies in the system that if people really knew the details of, they would be like, what are you all on? Why are you doing it this way? You know, and that's the sad thing. You're training up new people doing extremely complicated techniques that take them years to do, and maybe as their postdoc or their PhD, and then they're just disappearing. And then the next person comes along, wants to try and leverage that technique for the next research, that they're gone. Take somebody else another 2 years to learn how to use this particular piece of equipment or methodology.
It also occurs quickly that you know, a really important part of science and research is failure. You have to try things and be wrong and fail, and our system no longer has any room for failure. Yeah. I know we're getting a bunch of comments through in the chat, so I think we'll go to those. But quickly, just the last kind of discussion point before we do. So we talked a lot about precarity and sort of fixed term contracts, and you know, very few people are on permanent roles at universities anymore. So I think the CRI situation, from my experience with the CRI, depends on the CRI and even the department within the CRI very intensely. There are some CRI departments where everyone's permanent, and there are some where, you know, lots of people are on fixed term roles. It's complicated. The thing I'd like us to think about is we want stability. I think that's clear, because that supports people to do good science. But there is also a desire for some flexibility in terms of being able to go overseas, like Kyle did or I did, and in terms of being able to not necessarily just, you know, go back to DSIR and get a job at DSIR when you're 15 and then stay there until you retire. Maybe you're still there at a CRI, not that case. But how do we strike that balance between giving people that bit of stability and not demanding what we don't want in terms of like a job for life at a specific institution? What's that?
I mean, we need to have the options, because I mean, I tend more towards kind of wanting a bit more stability, but I know everyone has their own sort of individual level of comfort with risk, and depending on what stage of their life they're at. But right now it's like precarity is the option, right? Like, so some people, I don't know, some people might actually want a job for 50 years. Maybe not many people in this room, but some people might want it. So why don't we have a spectrum of options, all the way from like startup culture style, like, hey, we don't know if this is going to pan out, but like, let's give it a shot. Some people thrive on that. But right now, if you're worrying about, you know, how you're going to pay rent in a few months' time, or applying for a job, or the other one is finished, or, you know, it's just for the people who have anxiety like me, my gosh, no wonder I'm leaving. Yeah, that's it.
And what about you, Kyle? Since you're coming back into New Zealand, what, you know, ideally, what would the situation be like for you in terms of options?
Yeah, I mean, I would like the option to have something more stable when I come back. Even the position I'm coming back to is not like permanent, but I still prefer that over a permanent position overseas. My answer was exactly the same as and so I didn't quite see who was talking just then, but yeah, having a spectrum of options would be fantastic. And just, I don't know, there aren't many jobs where precarity is, you know, the only option. It makes me feel a little bit like we're not particularly valued, maybe, and that we don't sort of deserve flexibility in our work because we, you know, study what we want to do or something like that. You know, there's certainly benefits to being in academia, and I think precarity is kind of just this price that we pay for that privilege. In a way, I think that's the attitude that people have. But yeah, no, in a lot of industries like software engineering, for example, data science, people jump from job to job all the time. And they can stay in that job if they want to for longer periods. There's no expectation that they do stay for 5 or 10 years. But they can if they want to. They choose precarity. They choose that not precarity. Sorry, they choose that flexibility to move between positions. And I would love to see, that kind of option offered as well, where you can, start as a lecturer, for example, at university, and then if you find you don't like it in a few years, you can move into industry if you'd like to. But yeah, it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think it is. Troy, if you want to, if there's any specific questions or comments that our panelists might want to respond to from the chat.
Well, first of all, I'll pass on. There was a lot of chat where people were really appreciating the comment about understanding the business of science is something that is really valuable, but most people haven't had a chance to really appreciate or have developed. So I think that's something that's worth saying. I thought actually one of the best questions came from YouTube, and that was from Matthew Rowe. ECRs spend considerable effort and mental capacity finding solutions to future precarity. How does this loss of productivity in their current research factor into policy decisions? Why is it tolerated? And I'd kind of add on, are we really valuing that and making use of that effort that people are putting in?
Hi Matthew, what time is it in Sweden? Yeah, no, that's another inefficiency. Yeah, if people knew what it was actually like, I mean, it's such a unique situation where your job is, like I said, you've got the job, but now getting the money for your job, like, why do we let ourselves be in this situation? It's
This is broken.
yeah, I know. I sometimes I just don't have words for it. Yes, it's inefficient, and I mean, this is why I was kind of glad the Te Ara Whanangi process was going on. I just think we need to.
But has it got goals to be able?
I don't know.
Is it going to be able to tackle that problem?
I mean, that's why every time MB emailed me and say, "Hey, do you want to be on this discussion?" Right, I would make the time to be part of it, to make sure that they know that we know that this is the situation and that it's not acceptable. Except then I'd have to stay in the lab until like 9 or 10 p.m. to make up for the fact that I talked to MB all afternoon about it. It's like, no, everyone can do that. And I just think it comes down to just like a lack of fairness. Like, we should be just this sort of stuff that we're doing. It needs your whole brain. And every time we have to fight for stuff which should be like an employment right, it's like,
That's an excellent phrase, employment right.
Can I just break in and tell you the business of doing science is that you're paying, and a university, not exactly sure about Malahan and Motu, it's less, but it's still significant. You're paying overhead that should partly cover your time to be putting in these things, and yet you're probably putting in the full hours plus to do your science job, and then doing this other stuff sort of nice.
And I know not to make it sound like it's like for the ECR thing, and I know PhD students work hell hard, but also I know that our PIs and stuff and people at the other levels also work really hard. Like, that's part of the reason I don't want to be a PI, because I've seen how much they have to hustle to get their grants and things, and I know that they know, even if they don't say it, that the system is pretty messed up.
So it's a comment about career structure as well as what we think as a scientist. So some of the productive work that we did at University College London, we had someone who was a PhD. He was a technologist. Didn't want to be a PI. Didn't want to have that kind of thing. There are courses for courses, and I don't. That's another structural thing. We actually don't have enough flexibility within the system. It might outside the system coming back in.
Yeah. I didn't even know what a staff scientist was until I moved to the Melbourne. I just thought it was PIs and PhDs. I only met like 2 postdocs.
I'd probably just say on that question that it's actually in my job description to be an early career ambassador, so I have time within my normal working day to advocate on behalf of the early career community, which I think is fantastic, and I'd love to see it.
So do you still work 38.5 hours or 39 hours a week, or whatever your contract is?
I could have, yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm very passionate about this.
Because we all have 20% service.
I've got a lot of ACR stuff and nice committees and apart from the Morris Wilkins Centre actually gave me like 5K the last year for being the chair of their committee for a couple of years over. But that was towards research, but yeah.
Question. Do you think the way that society values scientists is related to the way that society values science? And it's not connecting to what we were talking about earlier, about you've got communication with the public, but you've also got evidence-based policy. We talked about the supply side of scientists. What about the demand side? And could we ramp up the demand side a bit more to get more demand for that science, that evidence, which then brings in more of a path and purpose area of
I think that New Zealand public love scientists. I think they love science, they love scientists. We're very responsive to the COVID crisis. And in that respect, we can see the understanding that, you know, science is going to be this, help us with this thing that nobody expected. But they don't know what we do. In the same way that many of our employers don't. The same. And so getting our stuff out there is very important because they pay the taxes, they pay the dollars. But well, let's do that science communication, of course. But that's structurally not, they're not the ones making the decision about. My husband could dictate some of my hours. He would very differently change my job, but he's no input into that. So maybe they should.
But there's more deep science prizes in studies now than in the past, but that's still a rarity. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of policy people are generic, process oriented people. It's necessary to have process people and rule followers, judging personality. But a lot of science is about questions of perceiving and don't necessarily fit well within rules. But very important to get into the questions. Yeah.
Like any algorithm, it's data in, data out, you stick in the wrong data. And I don't think we have the data set correct now, because I don't think that all the different parts of the policy procedure actually understand what we're talking about. And science is not a unitary thing. It's the same as science I do is not science that you do, or you know the CRO will do, or it's just it's all different. So what are our objectives and what's the best model for that? One size does not fit, and that's the other one.
Going back to the first part of your question, we used to joke sometimes in our tea room, like that if the scientists went on strike, would the public even care? Because they don't know what it is that we
are on strike. We're on strike right now.
When teachers go on strike and when nurses go on strike, you know, everyone gets in behind it. But would that be quite the case? Scientists. So I just think science communication is so important, and young people and old people, and transforming our science into a language that everybody understands, instead of just like 2% of the country actually true all ages.
All ages.
Can I jump in as well? This has been a great discussion. I want to thank all the panels. Fantastic. I work in a university, so I'm in Atlanta. I don't know how CRIs operate. Well, a comment and then I have a question. So my comment is technically, legally, if you're employed on short-term contracts for a certain period of time, then you become permanent. In the university system, so I've had my staff undergo this process. Doesn't mean that you are permanently employed, because it's all based on external contracts. But at least if you don't have funding and you have to leave the university, you get redundancy. So at least, and that's like in 20 jobs, I suppose. So I just want to put that out there that should be happening at all universities.
It sure is. Well, technically, it's the label that gets put on it. If you don't call them permanent staff as permanent staff, have tenure, but you're absolutely right. All it means is that you get redundancy
Yeah, if you can't find a job elsewhere in the
Yeah.
university.
on another fixed term contract.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, that's, you get paid out.
Okay, so that's my comment. So my question is, in a way, still in that system, what is the better system? Because, you know,
We're having a wine, aren't we?
you've been trained and you've got these skills. You want to carry on, but that work is being funded in the STEM areas anyway. Help research in my case. You need to still get the external contracts to actually provide for that work to be done. So how could a university operate in a way that keeps staff with variable funding coming in to support the work of that thing? What are you seeing as a better model in universities at least?
This was addressed a bit in TRI, this idea of base funding. So that there's some sort
Through
of
the
base
NZAS
funding.
submission.
Yeah, so if there's some base funding to go alongside the contestable funding, then it takes a little bit of the risk away from the universities and the other organisations for actually making some of this happen. I've been working at the University of Auckland doing diabetes research since 2011, although two schools on the same one. But yeah, I don't have permanency. I know they're trying to bring in some permanent roles, but they've made the criteria extremely difficult for anybody to actually qualify for. And then you've got a permanent contract, but you still have to bring in your salary.
So, yeah, it's not permanent what you're talking about, it's FTE specific, so they'll give you an FTE. So if you fell off your 100% fixed term contract, it might be 0.2 or 0.5,
Yeah.
like that. But it is testable. And it's very vague.
Yeah, so it's a bit random, but if they had some base funding, then it would take away, and maybe if they pushed and they sort of regulated the university and CRS performance, if you actually really have to tell us that, you know, how you're managing your staff. And then they could employ some more staff scientists like they do in South Africa. And then they've got a mechanism for maintaining skills and knowledge, you know.
I kind of quickly use chair privilege to say there's also a lot of industries where organisations, there's not necessarily testable funding, but their income streams are not fixed. Like if you're a lawyer or if you're doing consulting contracts, right? You don't know for sure what your income is going to be for the rest of time, but they still don't need to employ permanent staff.
So it's not invisible.
Yeah, there's this thing of like,
Except that we live in London. The kids rate for Marsden is 10%, isn't 10%.
Yeah.
HRC, then we managed to get up to 15% at one point, but it's down to now 12. The assessments that were done in Australia and New Zealand in the 1990s and 2000s said you needed to be above 20% to have a viable research funding structure.
Yeah.
So we actually have a problem with that. And then there's the whole cap thing that we can't even pay people properly within the system.
So about 8 years ago now, Adam Jaffa from Moltu and Sean Hendy made a case, amongst others, to raise Marsden so that the success rates would go back up to 20% and above. And they did, temporarily. And then the money, same money is still there. Arguably more researchers have flooded into the system. And success rates decline back down to 10% again over time,
Yeah.
right? So how do we prevent that? I think that's the real challenge, is how do we prevent precarity? What kind of system would work better? I still think the idea of base funding has an important role to play.
Well, that comes back to your GDP question, doesn't it? How much you're going to invest in science, contestable funding, or whatever mechanism that you want, like what funding for the overheads. What do we do with PBRF in a meaningful way, because it goes to institutions, not necessarily back to people who generated it, depending on which institution you're in. There are lots, I mean, and the government would say, we put a lot of money into you guys. I don't understand the problem. So we've just elucidated some of the problems there. But unless you have a proper structure of fellowships that are more than, I don't know, half dozen that we've got, I counted the other day, that you,
About 10 or something.
yeah, really, and then really they stop in, early, well, they've kind of made one and found their career now, but
It's kicking the can up.
but it is
You don't
kicking
have
the
a
can down the
full-time.
road. And yeah, it's investment, right? It's money, but it's how do you strategize the use of money in terms of what we've been talking about, as opposed to saying, yeah, we're just going to give you another how many million, but we'll keep the system the same. So the system's broken.
Yeah, does the word hyper contestability or hyper competition describe the current situation that you see?
Absolutely.
Is that,
I mean,
we've said that, right? But, you know,
unless you've got,
it's no longer. It's no longer the role competition was supposed to have in the system.
Yeah. and the concept of blue skies, if you're not with a strong group that's going to provide you with patronage and give you backing, you know, their CV onto your walls. If you're not in the right area now, and we're seeing a boxing up some of the areas, and we slice the pie, right? Somebody else earlier said, oh, it's not new money, it's the same money, but we just made that come over here now. So we have put more money to that. But we're still not addressing the key things, the science people. We've not actually got structure. And it's not attractive, except for those.
All right, so it is 12:59, and I believe I did see lunch coming in. So what I'm going to ask all our panelists is, as a kind of summary thing, if you could say briefly, you know, we've got this CARTA financing process coming through. We know it doesn't, as someone said in the chat, it doesn't include the universities, and that is a big gap for so many of our researchers at universities. But kind of accepting that as it is for the moment. When the report comes out in 2 weeks, and this is a white paper, so this is basically going to be a proposed course of action that I'm going to cabinet. They're not going to do a full consultation on it, so obviously we'll have chances to sort of respond through the media and have discussions, but it's not going to be like a rigorous consultation process. What do you most hope to see in that would give you, like, make you feel really positive about the direction the research system is going to go in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And we'll start again with Kyle.
Oof, God.
No pressure.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't know. I mean, I would simply, yes, I would simply like to just see a stronger pathway into science. It doesn't have to be into permanent science positions. It doesn't have to be, you know, highly paid lecturing positions that have teaching and stuff. I would like to see simply more maybe permanent research positions become available, higher a base funding where so for example, here in Japan, we no one's position is funded through grants. They're all scholarships or permanent, and they're all funded directly by the government. You apply for grants if you need extra work done, if you need some research assistance, if you need to travel, that kind of stuff. Everything else is just permanent. You have it. It's not going to be taken away from you. It's not going to. So there is competitive funding, but it's just for additional help. You know, I think I would like to see something more like that, where this hyper competitive aspect of research is not really necessary. Like, if you don't get the funding, it's not the end of the world. It's fine. You'll be fine. I think that would be lovely to see.
Laura?
Well, I repeat, science is business, and you should fund it appropriately. And science is driven by the people who come up with the ideas to make product. So that's part of the package. Get that structure correct. So let's invest in people. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, no, 100% what everyone else said. You know, if you look after the people, that's how we get the good science that we're aiming for, right? Like, nobody wants to see people living in poverty while they're trying to do groundbreaking, cutting edge stuff. So yeah, I'd like to see more of a commitment on fellowships, but and also not just postdocs, but continuing that whole path. So it's not just like you can see a stepping stone to academia if that is what you want to do. And then also more, I really liked the Royal Society ECR paper, the 7-pager, I think, that came out a few weeks ago, which had a sort of a structure where it's like, okay, right now we've got far too many people just pumping out PhDs, and then they just go into academia, but there's just no positions. And it's like, right, go off to the overseas, but you can't come back. And the alternative that they presented was this really awesome kind of a utopia, like be a bit more selective about PhDs, because not everyone actually needs a PhD. So we might actually need to have less of them, because if somebody sees PhD as their only option, you can say, hey, have you thought about this, which is in research, but you don't actually need a PhD for it. So then make sure that the pressure is off the system for the people that do actually, because I might have, if I have my time again, some days I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Like I can do research and other things that are valuable without it. And then making sure that the universities and industry and the CRIs are talking to each other more, because at the, like things like internships and much more of a variety of options introduced to people even before the PhD level, just so people, because I feel like it's misleading. You go into a PhD and you're not fully informed. Like we have informed consent for clinical participants. Why would you let people do a PhD without informed consent? Right? That's what I want to see. And more GDP onto research and development. But if COVID has taught us anything, it's that science is valuable. It's just nice to have.
It's cool to see the PhDs. I love it. Okay.
Do you know what? In reality, I can't dictate what's going to be in the white paper, because I don't understand the whole system. And that's the thing. People keep saying, well, you stop lynching and come up with answers. I don't know what the answers are, to be honest. I think I would really like to see a description of how the funding is going to be distributed in a way that's going to be beneficial. I would like to see an explanation of how it's going to be beneficial. I would like to see joined up thinking, you know, so they're not going to fix 3 problems and make 10 problems. That's the thing that I'm concerned about. And, you know, and I know university VCs are all concerned about their bottom lines disappearing. And that could potentially be detrimental to the rest of us if they see that the money that is flowing to them is going down. They could start slashing and burning their research staff. That would be it.
No, I don't pay for them. Just a
Yeah, so I mean, so yeah, I just hope I see something in there that looks promising. For the ones.
And Louise?
What was said earlier, I think a focus on people, diversity of people, and every scientist that I know comes into science with like enthusiasm and passion, and then over time that seems to kind of
You've got this.
the system that allows you know, scientists to maintain their enthusiasm and passion and drive for solving the challenges of the future.
That used to be the funding mantra. Treat them mean and keep them keen. You remember that one? Yeah. It has fund you, just the desires are keep going.
Doesn't pay the bills.
No, you know what? I can do something else.
All right, well, thank you everyone on the panel. This has been a really great discussion, and I thank you all for kind of being, you know, open and honest and thoughtful. And, you know, we have done a little bit of window that, but it hasn't been the whole thing, which is always good. So we are actually, this is the end of this session, and then we're going back for actually 2 hours over lunch, and then we'll come back online at 3 o'clock for the AGM and awards. So thank you to everyone online. The Zoom link will come down, and then you'll be able to come back on probably at about 5:03 for those next 2 things. So we will see all you online folks then. And thank you very much, Kyle, for your participation, and for everyone in the room. We now get to eat some lunch. And I hope all of you online also are going to get to eat some lunch.
And just one final note, technically the YouTube stream ends here as well, and it will pick back up again.
Yes.
Go through the at Phased in T channel rather than the same.
It should be the link, won't it be the link that I sent everyone this morning?
It may change.
Okay, it may change.
So if you go to my channel, you'll find it.
Yeah, so YouTube.
Did you say coming back at 3 or 2?
Oh, we're having a closed session at 2, so people here. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Cheers, everyone. And
Thank you.